know if they can. I think we're on mute.
Yeah, I think the green light.
Oh, maybe?
I hear you now, Brett.
Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome you to the regular meeting of the Milwaukee Planning Commission. It feels like it needs a gavel at some point. Agendas and additional copies of staff reports are available on the city website at www.milwaukeeoregon.gov. You may locate them by navigating to the community calendar where tonight's meeting page is posted. If you have not reviewed the agenda, please do so. It contains important information about our process. Native land acknowledgement. The city of Milwaukee respectfully acknowledges that our community is located on the ancestral homeland of the Clackamas people. In 1855, the surviving members of the Clackamas signed the Willamette Valley Treaty, also known as the Calliope, etc. Treaty, with the federal government in good faith. We offer our respect and gratitude to the indigenous people of this land. Moving on to the approval of the minutes from August 9th, 2022. Does anyone have any corrections?
Chair Losfeld, I don't know if we have meeting minutes in our agenda. Do we? Okay.
No?
I'd like to make a motion to accept the minutes from August 9th, 2022 as presented.
Second the motion.
All second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye, or raise your hand.
Aye.
Great. Unanimously approved. Meeting minutes from August 9th, 2022, without correction. Audience participation. This is an opportunity to comment on items not on tonight's agenda. Does anyone wish to comment on an item that is not on tonight's agenda? If participating virtually, please use the raise your hand function in Zoom to indicate that you wish to make a comment.
Chair, we have no attendees on the Zoom meeting.
Okay.
We skipped over the informational items, which I happen to have something this time.
Are there any informational items from staff?
Yes, there are, actually. I just want to let everybody know that the Milwaukee Housing Needs Survey is up. That's part of our housing needs analysis and housing production strategy. So it got posted yesterday. It's through the Engage Milwaukee site, and so spread the word that it's up. It's on a banner, and we've sent it out to the NDAs, and we've been doing some advertising. We already had a bunch of good hits. I think we've already got like 40 or 50 responses as of yesterday. So please let everybody know that it's up. We're trying to just get folks to participate in that. And then the other thing is with the Transportation System Plan Advisory Committee, you know that the recruitment process is open right now. It closes at the end of the week. We have had really good response to that. Right now we have 16 applications for 6 spots. And we're looking at it right now geographically. That's one of the things that we're looking at as we're looking at the makeup of it. And the only thing that I would point out is that we don't have any applications from the historic Milwaukee NDA. So I just wanted to put that out there in case anyone was interested in applying for that position, or not. It's not that position, but we're just trying to get it geographically represented throughout the city. So, but we have lots of good applications in so far. And that's it for the informational items. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on then, the Community Involvement Advisory Committee, the CIAC. At this point, on the agenda, the Planning Commission will act as the CIAC. I now ask staff to provide any updates.
The only update I have, which is just a reminder, we're having our annual meeting with the CIAC on October 11th. That's also the night that we're having the joint meeting with you all and the NDAs. John Hennington from the city's equity manager will be attending that night to talk to you as the CIAC, to talk about the city's equity work. And then we'll be having, following that, the conversation with the NDAs.
Okay.
So may I pose a question to staff on that topic?
Yes, please.
So you were looking to get some input from us so that you can nail down an agenda? Is that what I read in your email?
Yeah, what I did is I sent out the one from last year with some comments on it, but knowing Commissioner Massey, that you're going to the quarterly meeting on Thursday. So, but if there's any other topics besides whatever comes out of the quarterly meeting, just send them my way, and then I will send a revised agenda back out to you all by the end of the day on Friday, hopefully, so that we don't have a lot of turnaround time because of the 29th, and then we have to have the meeting packet posted on Tuesday. So it just has to be kind of quick, but yes.
So let me just share with the commission here. I looked at the minutes from last year in the joint meeting, and we had a pretty good discussion about barriers to feedback to the Planning Commission on land use applications. We had pretty good feedback about that, about notifications and timing and that kind of thing. I know we've made some changes to that. We had one of the topics in there is code and general questions, and that just didn't generate any discussion during the meeting. So we may or may not want to keep that. And Engage Milwaukee kind of had a mixed response. So at any rate, we've kind of repeated the agenda, but I just wanted to give you what I thought was the feedback from the last meeting with the NDAs. And if you'll allow me, I would just like to go through the major points of planning goal number 1 from the state. I'll go quickly, just as a primer to think about. And that's basically opportunity for wide involvement, effective two-way communications, ability of the public to be involved in all phases, making technical information easy to understand. That's an interesting one, because I think we've heard that in a roundabout way about we need some training and that kind of thing, and we've done that. Feedback mechanism for policymakers to respond to public input. And, I guess, the minutes of the meeting are that, but I'm not sure if we want to go beyond that. And then financial support for public involvement. So that's out of the statewide planning goal number 1 that just think about if you want to, send something into Laura for, to think about the agenda, how we might want to approach this.
I think the feedback that I would have is, although we may not have had much discussion about the code, I think we should still present it, summarize it.
It's kind of like it's kind of a general question. It's like other topics, and I'm not sure you want to remove it, but I'm just saying it didn't generate any discussion.
I remember that piece too.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because people need more time to digest the presentation of whatever code update or that we're making, because it's hard to understand that quickly, or it might be.
Yeah.
Well, and I appreciated staff, I noticed in Jason's kind of weekly email, specifically about the meeting on the 11th, sharing out the links to the Land Use 101 training, because I think that is kind of provides a basic foundation on which some community members, can kind of start to wrap their minds around the complexity of code and those kinds of things that I know is also a barrier, and that was kind of identified. So I appreciate staff doing that, but I do think finding those opportunities to kind of more meaningfully engage. Is always a goal to strive for.
Yeah, that training, that really can't be a one-off thing, because there's just moving it in and out of the NDAs, and I'm not saying doing it every month or anything like that, but we need to repeat it, I think, at some kind of, interval and that kind of thing. Seems like I dialed into that one. It seemed like we had about, 7 or 8 people? Does that sound about right?
We did, and it is posted on the web, so anyone can watch it.
Yeah, you can do it self-paced, yeah. Thank you.
Other feedback, questions, comments?
One thing that is maybe adjacent to the NDA meeting, I'm not sure how many other commissioners are aware of some of the discussions council has been having on climate action goals and strategies we might be able to advance related to that. One of which has been a discussion about methane gas. And I don't know if that would go through a land use process, if potential bans on methane gas were to be enacted. I did come and testify to council as an individual, not as a representative of our commission, but raised some process and community involvement concerns and big moves like that. And so not sure from staff, how those mechanisms would be enacted, but did want to encourage us to continue to make sure we're involving our community in some of those big decisions that could impact the entire community, some of which haven't, had a lot of engagement to date. So wanted to just mention that to other commissioners. Again, maybe it's adjacent to CIAC, knowing this is land use focused, but not knowing if some of those proposed policies would go through a land use process to be implemented. That's why I'm raising it here.
Chair, if I may.
Yeah.
I'm with you. I think we need all of those things you described, but we had a fairly lengthy discussion about the lane that the CIAC was going to operate in. And my reading of the state law and of the bylaws kind of keeps it right in land use. Because we had this discussion about, don't we have an opportunity to expand this along your lines? But I think where we're operating right now is land use.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay.
And then one thing that I would like to add too, and I don't know if this is going to be shared during the leadership meeting or not, but the results from the Engage Milwaukee, if for those of you who don't know, that they Engage Milwaukee put out an NDA questionnaire. And I don't know if those results may be beneficial for us to share publicly here if they are available, and how that ties into land use. But as an overall general statement, it does ask, how do you get your information from, and that kind of stuff. And so I think that kind of helps to tie in, and maybe that's a good way to present the information if the information is available.
I can check in with Jason about the status of that and when he might be ready to share that, when it'll be ready.
Yeah, and I don't know when it closes either, so.
I'm not sure. Okay, I'll follow up with him.
Does anyone in the audience, do we have an audience?
We do not.
Okay. Will you let me know if we have an audience? Brett, you're just honorary. Well, I guess, do any CIAC members have any items to report? I think we covered that. Folks virtual are being awfully quiet.
Well,
It's okay, 'cause it
one
helps me move
clarification,
along.
I'm sorry. Is it okay if I just take my observations from the meeting this week and distribute them? Because we're kind of on a tight deadline.
Sure, I think you could do that and
Okay.
then,
Hold on, I'm not understanding the suggestion. What?
Well, basically, I'm going to go to the meeting this week,
Yes.
and I was going to take my observations and summarize those and just distribute them to the commission and the staff. Because we're kind of on
That's
a...
allowable.
That's what I'm asking.
yes.
Okay?
Okay.
Just because this other meeting's going to come up pretty soon and
Yep.
give you more time to chew on it.
Thanks for doing that.
Okay?
Appreciate it. Make sure I don't skip anything. Hearing item. All right, code amendment, high density zones. The public hearing, The public hearing on ZA-2022-002 is called to order. The purpose of this hearing is to consider legislative amendments to the high density zoning code and map. If you are here to testify, please remember to confine your remarks to the application and relevant criteria, and avoid repetitious and non-relevant information. The Planning Commission will make a recommendation to council regarding whether the proposal conforms with all city applicable criteria. I now ask staff to cite the zoning ordinance section or sections where the criteria can be found.
Thank you, Chair. The amendments are proposed in many titles of the code, so if you'll forgive me, it's a long list. The proposed amendments affect the following sections of the code: the Milwaukee Comprehensive Plan, residential land use designations, Title 19, introductory provisions, Section 107 zoning, definitions and measurements in Section 200, 19.300 base zones, including 19.301 moderate density residential zone, 19.302 high density residential zones, 19.303 commercial mixed use zones, 19.304 downtown zones, 19.306 limited commercial zones, 19.307 general commercial zone, and 19.312 North Milwaukee Innovation Area. Section 19.505 building design standards, chapter 19.600 off-street parking, section 19.904 community service uses, section 19.905 conditional uses, section 19.1104 expedited process for annexations, Title 14 signs, 14.04 general provisions, and 14.04.030 definitions.
Thank you. Now for commissioner participation. Does any member of the Planning Commission wish to declare an actual or potential conflict of interest?
No.
No.
Okay. Does any member of the Planning Commission wish to abstain?
No.
Okay. And then let's proceed to the staff report.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Let me, share my screen. Okay. Hopefully everyone has seen the presentation. Good evening, Chair and members of the Commission. Vera Coley, Senior Planner, with Adam Hiru, Associate Planner, here to present the code amendments regarding the high-density residential zones and our consolidation project. All right, this is just a reminder of our timeline. As we've been going through, we've had 3 work sessions this summer to work through the proposal, landing us here at the public hearing, which hopefully will culminate with a recommendation to City Council. We have a work session scheduled with the City Council to discuss the proposed amendments on October 18th, and we have tentatively scheduled our public hearing with the Commission or with the Council on December 6th. This presentation is a summary of all of the discussions from the previous 3 work sessions. We've incorporated comments and recommendations from the Commission from the last work session into the proposed amendments. And of course, we're happy to take questions as we go, and we will make sure that we pause for any questions as we go before we finish. All right. As a reminder, we originally planned to consolidate the high-density residential zones during phase 1 of our comprehensive plan implementation project when we were working on the middle housing work, but we realized that it was a little more complicated than just a simple consolidation and needed more analysis, which is why we sort of put a pin in that project until we were finished with the middle housing section, and we're doing it tonight. This map shows our existing zoning with the high-density residential zones. We have 5 high-density residential zones, R3, R2.5, R2, R1, and R1B. And this map just pulls out just the high-density residential zones, so you can see them and where they are in the city. So they're isolated on this map. Most of the land mass in the high-density residential zones is sort of consolidated around the downtown a bit and in central Milwaukee, as well as around the King Road Shopping Center. But there are some pockets of R1, R2, and R3 in the eastern part of the city as well. The total amount of land in our high-density residential zones is about 330 acres and is approximately 650 individual tax lots, more than 600 of which have already been developed. The next few slides show some snapshots of some of our of the development underneath that are on the in our high density residential zones, just so you can have a sense of where they are and what there is on there. So in our R1 zone, this is just some snapshots of the Kellogg Creek apartments, as well as the apartments on Railroad, Harmony, and Linwood Ave on the image to the right. In our R2 zone, Waverly Apartments on the left-hand side. And then we also have some more R2 zoning area, again, multifamily development or multi-unit development along Lake Road. Some additional R2, again, along Lake Road and on River Road as well, as you can see here in these images from our zoning map. And then the R3 zone along 34th and Harrison, as well as the Providence Hospital area. And the hospital site itself is zoned R3, but the hospital is there by virtue of a community service use designation. And then there's some additional R3, the Brookside Apartments that are along just off of Johnson Creek Boulevard, as well as some multifamily development there on 43rd Avenue as well. And then around the King Road Shopping Center, you see some R3, and then there's a tiny little pocket of R2.5. That is the R2.5 zone. There are 6 lots right there. That's it for the R2.5. And then there's some additional R3 and areas along on King Road, south of King Road at Linwood as well. I'm going to hand the presentation portion of this section of the uses and so on over to Adam to go over why we're here and the use consolidation as well.
Thank you, Vera. So City Council prioritized the sort of redo of the high density zones, the consolidation and the simplification as part of the comprehensive plan process. There's also a goal in this project to remove barriers and bias from the code. Milwaukee right now treats a lot of allowed uses that have similar land use impacts in disparate ways, so this seeks to remedy that. There's also a lot of outdated terminology in the code that goes back many decades, and so we've proposed some new terms to better match the terminology that's used by the state of Oregon when licensing community-based care settings. And then also there are probably too many use categories, so we're trying to streamline some of those with the proposal as well, and also streamlining some of those review processes that projects have had to go through in the past. So here you can see some of the uses that are allowed in the zones currently. So this is kind of where we're at now before the changes that we're proposing. The state of Oregon does not use any of those first 4 highlighted terms there, or sorry, the first 3 highlighted terms in their licensing for community-based care settings, and the city has typically used the state's updated terminology when issuing certificates of occupancy. It's worth noting as well that congregate housing facility as well as residential home are terms that date way back to legislation at the federal level in 1978 and 1988, and none of the neighboring jurisdictions that staff researched for this code update use the term residential home in their code, so that one's particularly outdated. City code does not define nursing home either, which you don't see on here. It's because it's a community service use, but the term does have very specific standards as a use in the CSU section of the code. It's also worth noting that congregate housing facilities are currently treated pretty much the same as multi-unit developments, and despite having similar land use impacts, senior and retirement housing are subject to the CU process in additional zones in the R2. I think ready for the next slide. So we've been to the commission and worked through some of these terms here. So this is just kind of an update and a review of where we're at. You can see the types as they exist in the code, and then you can see the definition that the state is using or the terms that the state is using for these. And then we've got our new use type in the right column, which is what will appear in the use tables for development standards and those sorts of things, or allowed uses, those tables. And work session 3, which we held, worked to resolve some of the discrepancies that resulted from consolidating these into residential care facility, for instance, and also looking at boarding houses a little bit differently as well.
I wonder if this might be, we're going to be shifting over to office uses and definitions in a second, but just wondering if there are any questions from anyone, any members of the commission, clarifying questions or anything before we continue on. Hopefully this sounds familiar to everyone?
Yeah, definitely sounds familiar. I have a question, Chair. I'm curious, maybe going back to some of the examples of parcels, what changes are going to be manifest, if any, for some of the parcels, particularly whether or not they'll be kind of upzoned in terms of, higher maximum building height or changes to maximum lot coverage, those kinds of things. Would it be possible to even anecdotally just talk through a few of those examples?
We could, when I get to the development standard section, we can talk about that, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to be
We'll definitely do
clear, I think some of the spirit behind my question is, one thing I'm thinking about is some of our very, actually not even some, because we only have a few manufactured housing parks, which I think are particularly susceptible to redevelopment and gentrification and displacement. And so I want to be really intentional about what we're thinking there. And, even if we don't make a change here, I hope City Council would be really thoughtful about that.
Okay. If there aren't any other questions about sort of the terminology and sort of our consolidation of terms, we'll continue on sort of the vein of uses and that discussion. Part of this amendment, because we're working with the R1B zone, that does have some allowed commercial uses. We also decided, we're sort of opening the door a little bit to talk about office uses because we've made sort of as staff over the years, we make code changes and we don't always follow them through all of the code. They're sort of only effective certain parts of the code. So we're trying to get everything as consistent as we can. And right now, in certain zones, there are three office types: production-related office, professional administrative office, and traditional office. And these came about when we were working on the downtown code, and then that got carried over into the North Milwaukee industrial area as well. And so those office types are regulated in both the DMU and the NMIA zones, but they weren't carried over into the other commercial zones in the city. So we have different kinds of offices being talked about in different zones. And so that may be the office use category, but we have these even more specific uses. So because office uses are permitted either outright or as conditional uses in our high density zones, this was an opportunity to create some consistency across the code. So it's an opportunity to consolidate the types because there is some overlap in the definitions. So what we're proposing is to keep the production-related office use, and that's the type of office that doesn't generate a lot of foot traffic, and then combine the other two, professional and administrative office and traditional office, into one type, professional administrative office, and then make those changes throughout the code for consistency. And the draft or the underlined strikeout version of the code, and the code that was attached as part of this, makes those changes throughout the code. So wherever office was identified as being a permitted use or any kind of a use in those commercial zones, we've made these changes throughout the code. So we don't have different kinds of uses, different kinds of offices throughout the code.
And Vera, if I may, just for audience sake, and maybe for just a little bit of my understanding as well, that the amount of employees and the type of work that you do somewhere else in the code determines parking and square footage ratio and all sorts of stuff, right?
Right, yes, yeah. So offices are, and that's in the parking section of the code, for example. So the parking ratios of the required minimums and maximums are associated with, with the use. So yes, so offices and, or retail uses, any of those uses are all broken down in the parking section of the code, correct?
Thank you.
Yeah. So we're sort of going to ease into the consolidation part here. So this first slide shows the existing code, with all of our all of the 5 zones that we have currently for high density residential zones, with the revised uses. So as Adam was talking about, having the multi-unit development, single room occupancy housing as opposed to boarding houses. So the idea of using SROs, and I know that, and I think we talked about this in the staff report at our last work session, we talked about maybe using the term micro unit. But single room occupancy is a term that's already used at the state level. So as much as we wanted to kind of offload that term for consistency purposes with the state as well, we wanted to kind of bring that back and make sure that we weren't in conflict with any other kind of entity or any kind of agency. So we're coming back with the single room occupancy. And then you can see that we have residential care facility, as Adam talked about, and underneath that are sort of those subtypes of, or examples, assisted living, nursing facility, or memory care community. So this is what the table would look like if we didn't consolidate the zones, but we worked on this updating of terms in the uses. And now this chart shows the proposed consolidation itself. So going from 5 zones to 3, where the R3 zone is a combination of the existing R3 zone with those 6 tax lots of R2.5 into the new R3. And then the new R2 zone is the R2 zone with the R1, which in the R1 zone right now, I counted the lots, the R1 only has 4 tax lots in the R1. So I think it's, we're
Very special.
Yeah. Yes, and then the R1B remains the R1B zone. We're not changing either the boundaries or the tax lots that are part of that. So some of the key differences within this consolidation, that multi-unit housing would be allowed by right in the R3 as opposed to a conditional use process. Single room occupancy would be allowed by right as opposed to the CU process. Residential care facilities would be permitted by right as opposed to a conditional use process. So trying to streamline those review processes for those uses. We're also proposing to add business and personal services as a commercial use. Those are things like salons and pet groomers, those sorts of things. That would be included in the list of allowed commercial activities in the R1B zone. We get a lot of requests for salons and nail salons and that sort of thing in some of the smaller they look like kind of medical buildings here on the R1B. And those aren't really offices. So we thought that seemed like a reasonable sort of expansion of the kinds of limited commercial uses that could be permitted in the R1B. And following our discussion at the last work session, there was discussion from the commission that those uses would be proposed to be permitted by right on a limited in the R2 and the R3 zones as well. And what we are proposing that the floor area for those businesses would be limited to 2,000 square feet. That's a square footage that's used in other zones as a limitation for the square footage size in some of our limited commercial zones as well. So we thought that was a reasonable limitation, but we would still allow them by right. They would just be limited in size so that there would be a little more commercial activity in those other high density residential zones. Again, the office uses are proposed to be consolidated. And then given our discussion at the last work session, hotel and motel uses are proposed to be permitted as conditional uses in the R3 and in the R2 zones rather than be prohibited. They're prohibited in the current zone, right, in the current code right now. So those sort of, in that red circle, those were sort of the sections that came about from our discussion at the last work session. And maybe I'll pause here to see if there are any questions about kind of how the use table and the consolidation of the zones, if this is reflective of the discussions that we've had and if this sort of fits with what you were thinking that we would be proposing. And if we got it right, I guess.
Vera, can you remind me what some of our position or discussion about allowing the hotel or motel as a conditional use? I remember the discussion about bed and breakfast, but the hotel and motel, did we agree that it was limited by size somehow, and so that the scale of those was more supported by an R3, R2?
The discussion, or at least what we've reflected in the code, is not a limitation in the size, but in that the development standards in the base zone would be a limitation, and certainly tax lot size and what kinds of properties are available there. And so it's as I recall, the discussion seemed to be that, well, how different are those from bed and breakfast or a vacation rental? What is the likelihood of development that is out of scale? Also because it's limited by, it's a conditional use. So that's a type 3 review here before the Planning Commission with approval criteria that talks about impacts to, neighborhood, compatibility with the surrounding area. So very discretionary approval criteria. So that's how we kind of came to that conclusion, but certainly maybe this is something that for deliberation, certainly with, with the commission at the conclusion to see if that was the intent, if that was where you thought we were going to go, or if there are some things that might be recommendations that you want to send to the city council that, yep, this is okay, but we think we should be thinking about something else. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if that's what you were thinking, happy to hear that if that's okay.
Chair, if I may.
Yes.
I've been around a long, long time. I don't remember ever seeing an L on a table before. Is that new?
Oh, if I may, we have Ls in the table in the NMIA zone, actually, as well. So, and it's a way of getting you to a different section that, in the same section, but that talks about what are the limitations. In our DMU, we also have limitations on the sizes of certain things. Square footage for retail uses can't exceed 20,000 square feet. So actually, and in the NMIA, we also have limitations on the square footage of certain uses as well. So we do use the L as a way of keying folks to, yes, it's permitted, but it's limited, and go to this section.
Right, it's permitted, right. So technically would be a P and then, but you put the L there just so that everybody knows that there's some sort of limitation
Something that goes with it, yeah. You don't get everything you want, I guess. Okay. So this map reflects the consolidation. So just from a mapping standpoint to see where the new R3, and so the changes aren't gigantic because the R3 is the same R3, but it pulls in the R2.5 near the King Road, so it doesn't look that different. And the R2 is still the R2, but it pulls in those 4 tax lots of R1. So the map shouldn't look too drastically different. All right. And this table, Adam pulled together the data just to give you sort of a snapshot of what this consolidation means from, total acres and total number of tax lots, and a snapshot of what those different zones have as far as existing development. So, we've got 38 lots that have some commercial development on them, multi-unit development of 2 or more dwellings, and then the single detached dwellings. So you can get a sense of sort of what's there now as part of that consolidation. So you have a sense of what we have. And again, there, I think, 6% or about 40 of the total of the tax lots in our high density zones are considered vacant as the county classifies those lots. Okay. And development standards. And so Commissioner Sherman, this will get to hopefully some of your questions about what this means for those lots. So of course the consolidation affects some of the development standards because we're gluing them together and they're not all the same across the 5 zones. So you can see in the existing code, there are a few differences, particularly with lot coverage and minimum vegetation and density and maximum building height. So these are sort of the 4 kind of key standards that have differences amongst the 5 zones. So the table that we've proposed to consolidate those standards to be consistent with the intent and purpose of the zones, as well as the goals of the comprehensive plan to try to streamline and to try to encourage more development in those high density zones. So what we're proposing is to keep the 35-foot maximum building height in the R3 because that is the combination of the R3 and the R2.5. Building heights in the R2 and the R1B will be what they are now, so 45 feet. We're not increasing the building height to over what there is now. The maximum lot coverage is consistent. R1B stays the same, of course. R2 is the 45%, which it is now, and R3, again, 40%. 40%, so no big changes there. Same for the minimum vegetation, that is consistent through the consolidation to what there is now. There is a change in the density. So the maximum density in the R3 creeps up a bit to the 17.4, which is the R2.5 density. So there's a little bit of a bump in density in our new R3, in our new proposed R3 zone. And then in the new R2 zone, we're pulling in the density from the R1 zone. So there is an increase in the density for the new R2 zone to match what we currently have in the R1 zone, because we don't want to reduce density through that consolidation. But still in keeping with the intent and purpose of a high-density residential zone, as well as what our comprehensive plan is looking to do to try to get some more residential development. So to your question, Commissioner Sherman, I think what we could certainly see are some additional dwelling units potentially being included as part of some of these developments. We have had some existing multi-unit developments call us and ask about, well, could I convert, or could I add a studio apartment? Could I add some units into the existing buildings, not even expanding footprints? But with our existing density standards, we actually couldn't allow that. So this can allow for some additional bumps in numbers of units into some of our existing built developments, as an example. But that's the big change, is really the number of units that could be permitted on those lots. And as part of those development standards, we talked about this at our last work session as well, but our current code includes a minimum site size requirement standard for the R2, R1, and the R1B zones. And what we're proposing is to eliminate that minimum site size and use our density standards as a way of figuring out how many units are permitted on a site. Those site size requirements could unintentionally discourage or prevent development of multi-unit housing. And so as with our other zones, we're recommending using density as a way of governing how many units can be built on a zone as opposed to a site size requirement. This addresses the issue also that middle housing doesn't have maximum densities. There aren't, those sorts of things. So it seems that this which would bring multi-unit development more in line with the goals and objectives of a high density zone as well. Okay, so that concludes our presentation. We wanted to make sure that we went through all of the, the key aspects of the code and the 3 work sessions and the discussion topics that we had. Happy to answer any questions, of course, that the commission has. And we can certainly, we do have the ability to go into the Milwaukee maps. If there are particular lots that you want to take a look at through our GIS, we can do that too. I know that had come up at one of our last meetings. So, but I'm going to stop sharing for the moment. And Adam and I are here to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Commissioner Edge?
Thank you, Chair. So one of the standards that I don't see shown here
Commissioner
is...
Edge, hold on. Can you try again, Commissioner Edge?
Thank you, Chair.
Better.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. So, Vera, one of the standards that I don't see shown here is the minimum front setback, or minimum front yard setback. And as I was looking through the code for R1B, it looks like it's 20 feet. It's consistent with the R2 and the R3 zones. But when I look at the R1B zoned lots in those districts, just anecdotally, I see a pretty large proportion of lots that don't seem to comply with the 20-foot minimum setback. And so is that fair to say? Is that a fair, do you have any numbers, any idea of what the compliance with that is in R1B right now? Or are we just looking at a lot of lots that are out of compliance with the standard?
Through the chair, I don't have any specific tallies or numbers. I didn't go through to look at that, and if we take a minute break, I can probably go through our Milwaukee maps and see. But I guess I would say anecdotally, I wouldn't be surprised if there is existing development that doesn't meet, that setback. There's existing development that doesn't meet any number of our development standards as, the standards change. Certainly, the existing R1B zone is closer to downtown, smaller lots, just existing slightly denser development. So it could very well be that they were developed under, with smaller front yard setbacks. The code changed, required a 20-foot, and now, it's non-conforming development. So that could certainly be the case. But I don't have any specific stats to support that.
So and then process-wise, if a development were to occur on a lot in R1B, with the 20-foot setback, and say that your neighbor, you want to build something that resembles, what your neighbor is doing, if they were less than the 20-foot setback, that would require a variance.
Correct, yes.
And we would allow that to be varied, I suppose, but it would require that extra layer of review, correct?
Correct, yeah, a variance would be required, either a type 2 or a type 3, depending on how much of a variance they requested, yes.
And okay, thank you. I think that's all a lot of questions I have about this part. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Edge. Other commissioners? Clarifying questions for staff? Okay. Thank you, Vera. Thank you very much, both of you. Now we move on to testimony. Have we received any correspondence on this matter other than those included in the meeting packet this evening?
We have not, no.
Okay. Do we have any audience?
We do not, either in the room or on the Zoom call, no.
Okay, then I'm gonna bypass audience testimony. I'm gonna bypass rebuttal. Oh, all right, the public testimony portion of this hearing on ZA-2022-002 high-density zones is now closed. Is the commission ready for discussion?
Yes.
Yes.
I would love to hear Commissioner Sherman's thoughts on the proposal of the manufacturing dwelling and it being not allowed in any zone and a type 3 variance in the other zone.
I don't know if that was necessarily my proposal there, Commissioner Hemer. I think, one thing I've been thinking about recently, just driving my children around town, is I've seen a number of our multi-unit dwellings, some older building stock that's actually undergoing massive renovations right now. And I don't think anybody's living in those. I think tenants were asked to leave as massive renovations have been going on. At least 2 apartment complexes kind of come to mind, and recognizing, which I think means and shows that what we already know, that Milwaukee's a really desirable place. And I'm sure the rents in those new units or those renovated units will be command market value. And thinking about people living in manufactured dwelling parks and knowing that this is some of the last unregulated, deeply affordable housing in the region, I just want us to be thoughtful about the changes that the zoning changes that we're making that affect those parcels. And recognize that's outside the scope of kind of this project that staff was charged with, but, maybe we can recommend on to council to, think seriously about, moves other jurisdictions have made to, try and protect people living in manufactured dwelling parks, coming up with zoning overlays and other kinds of creative things like that. So that was kind of the spirit and thought behind my question there, Mr. Hemer.
Chair, if I may.
Vice Chair Edge.
Thank you. Commissioner Sherman, I think that this will probably be covered in the current housing process that the city is going through, and I think that first of all, I would agree with you that if we do want to approve some comments to send to City Council on the subject to further study, protecting, mobile home parks. I think that would be a good thing to do, and I would support doing that. But I do think that through the housing work that we're doing at this time, that, kind of preserving that deeply affordable housing, will, and strategies for doing so will come out of that process as well. And so I think that in the context of what we're reviewing tonight, that the changes are pretty minimal to, the manufactured home parks. And so, the one that we have, I think, is in the R3 zone, and it's not changing, significantly with these amendments. So, in terms of what they would be able to do, or significantly changing the math on redeveloping, that parcel, I think. So, I think that we can, again, approve a comment, if, at the commission's discretion, but we'll have opportunities to revisit this. If that's all we have on this topic, I have other comments.
Anyone else want to comment on the mobile home housing piece? Commissioner Sherman?
Yeah, I appreciate your comments there, Vice Chair Edge. It's reassuring to hear. I just, know often the market moves a lot faster than government ever can. And, again, just thinking about, I think there's, at least in some of the manufactured dwelling parks in the city, I think we've got well over 50 units, and who knows how many people that is living there. So just wanted to put a fine point on that as we're deliberating on this topic, but I think I feel comfortable moving forward.
Okay. Commissioner Erd?
I just have a quick question. I don't know if this actually relates, but can we code-wise require manufactured home parks to be owner occupied owned?
Can't require any owner occupied.
I think so.
Like if, I guess I'll just do some more research on the side. I agree with trying to protect as much kind of affordable housing, and manufactured homes are, affordable housing. So I agree with everybody's comments here. I was just curious because I know that the more that we can encourage manufactured homeowners to own the property, the land collectively, the better, just across the board. I just don't know if we can require that with city code.
The county has a manufactured home park code where, regardless of the zone, the zoning designation is not really through the land use code, I think, but the way that they handle it is that if you intend to redevelop a mobile home park, you have to notify the residents, and the residents have the opportunity to buy the mobile home park before redevelopment. Otherwise, it's like you have to buy them out, or it's a 5-year, development moratorium.
Okay.
And so there's a little bit of regulatory, maneuvering there. And so I think that at the city council's direction, the city could certainly study its options in terms of protection. And so, again, I don't think that we need to be prescriptive in what we suggest to city council, but certainly studying what other jurisdictions in the area are doing, I think would be worthwhile comments to send on to city council.
And because if we had land here in Milwaukee that somebody wanted to buy and develop for a manufactured home park, like how could we maybe put protections in place in that scenario? But yeah, that would be where my thoughts would go. But good information, thank you.
I just raised the question about the hotel or motel previously being not permitted and now being a conditional use through R3, R2. And I guess maybe my recollection, I'm not recalling us specifically talking about that, but and I'm also not myself agreeing that hotel or motel is the same as or similar to bed and breakfast or vacation rental. Anybody else recalling that conversation or have any concern? Am I alone in my concern?
I share your concern, but I think I remember us discussing it.
Me and you specifically?
Well, I think, I don't know. I thought that the conclusion was that the function was the same, but generally the scale is different.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I share your concern, and I'm trying to think through a scenario for a conditional, use of a hotel going into these kind of neighborhoods. And so I just don't want an unintended consequence here because I think it would be out of scale, out of proportion.
Right.
But, it is conditional use, but I'm trying to figure out, I'm just trying to figure out a use case, or a model about how this happens or how it's prevented or whatever. And I just don't know the answer, but I share your concerns. But I think that we did sort of agree that a bed and breakfast and a hotel actually serve the same function, but just difference in scale.
I recall that piece.
Sure.
I guess I'm still not comfortable with it being a conditional use.
No. I think what really happened is that we determined that a bed and breakfast and a vacation house was much more the same than a hotel or motel. And so once we came to that conclusion, we had a discussion about, oh, well, should we allow hotels or motels? And we said, well, if we're going to allow bed and breakfasts or vacation rentals, why wouldn't we allow a hotel? If you're thinking of an Embassy Suites, I don't think that you're thinking on the right scale. What you're really thinking of is more like a King's Row, kind of a hotel, 5 or 6 bungalows that are rented hourly, daily, weekly, or monthly, right? Something like that. And so I think that's kind of the difference. I'm fine with it being a conditional use. I don't think that you're going to see a lot of them pop up anyways. And we decided that the bed and breakfast, by definition, it was an occupancy owner that was serving breakfast or serving a collective group of people, where a hotel or motel would not necessarily serve that function.
Vera, I'm
Sure,
just
if I may.
uncomfortable with it now, and I'm sorry that I'm bringing this back up, but it's just, I can imagine it being out of scale in the context of an R1 or an R3 or an R2.
So what would be your proposal?
I would like to understand how this would play itself out, maybe in an example scenario, and what scale and size we could get to within an R2 or 3.
So the building can only be 45 feet tall, which is 3 stories. Well, 2.5, right, by definition of our code, I think. And it can only hold per amount of density per acre, no matter what, right? So if it's on a 10,000 square foot lot, if the max is 32, it can only have 8 rooms. Is that correct?
Well, but density, if I, through the chair, density is a function of dwelling units, which these are not. So it really is development standards.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's setbacks, it's height, it's minimum vegetation, it's not, and parking, off-street parking would be required as well.
Only for so long.
Well, for the moment, right, but yes, but the density wouldn't apply to a hotel or motel because those aren't residential, they aren't dwelling units.
But those dwelling units would probably have some driver on parking
Yes.
requirements?
So I guess
Yeah.
because this is our last work session and we are either making a recommendation or not, I think I would ask that city council consider that, or that we at least provide that information to city council in the next work session that they have. Just so that we can fully understand those impacts.
So this is a hearing, so we'll be taking whatever you recommend to city council.
Correct.
So, yeah.
In their work session in early
Got it.
October.
So are you comfortable with making a recommendation that, that not all of, depending on how we vote, not all the commissioners are comfortable with the CU use of the hotel and motel?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Chair, if I may.
Vice Chair Edge.
Thank you. I've been anxiously awaiting the opportunity here. I was a pretty vocal proponent of allowing these uses as conditional uses. I was even pushing to allow them as primary uses, but you know, it's a conditional use in R1B, and you know, and the idea was that when you look at the development opportunities in the city in the R2 and R3 zones, that those tend to be in areas like 32nd Avenue corridor or close to downtown, where you know, the transportation infrastructure is good, walkability is good, and then, you know, being able, and lot sizes generally are fairly small, and so, you know, we're looking at, you know, geometry providing pretty tight constraints over what could even be accomplished. And so we're really looking at something like what I offered as an example is something like a boutique hotel. You know, that would be on a smaller lot and, you know, would be, you know, walkable to downtown amenities and, you know, things like that. The scattered R2 and R3 sites in the city are largely already developed and would not make good candidates for a hotel development. And so, and then also, you know, being able to use the conditional use review to, you know, make sure that we're consistent with city policies, you know, made this sound like it was, you know, something that, you know, we wouldn't see a lot of, but it would certainly create some interesting development opportunities, particularly close to the downtown part of the city where, you know, where a few additional smaller hotels might, you know, might be beneficial. So that was my argument for it. Really strongly in favor of this amendment. I think this is exactly what, you know, staff did exactly what I thought we asked for at the end of that last work session. And so I'm particularly happy with this and would like to see us, you know, recommend this as drafted. But I would be happy to hear out other concerns or, you know, have staff pull up a map and look at some of these zoned areas so that we can see, you know, what lot would get redeveloped into or developed with, you know, a hotel use. And I, you know, most of those are going to be where we would want them, you know, close to central Milwaukee or downtown.
Thank you, Vice Chair Edge.
I think I agree with much of what Vice Chair Edge was saying. I'd also be happy to pull up a map and talk through a few specific use cases. I think I can't think of a single hotel or motel currently within the jurisdictional limits of the city of Milwaukee. And I think that if one were to appear, and I'll repeat the word if, it would probably be like Vice Chair Edge said, probably a smaller boutique operation, probably located closer to downtown. And I think businesses downtown would probably be generally excited to have tourists and other visitors. So again, I think it's fairly unlikely to occur, and I feel comfortable with it where it is right now.
Okay. I am ready for a motion unless there are other points of discussion that commissioners want to raise.
I'd like to make a motion that the Planning Commission is recommending to City Council approval of file ZA 2022-002 and adoption of the proposed ordinance and recommended findings in support of approval found in attachments 1 with special notice to review the manufacturing dwelling unit portion, as well as reviewing the hotel motel conditional use.
I'll second that motion.
Has been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please state aye.
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 Right.
All right, we have a unanimous support for passing of ZA-2022, or recommendation, rather, decision or recommendation to city council, which will make the final decision after a public hearing. Please see planning and staff for details concerning the city council hearing date and process.
Chair Liswell, could we take a 2-minute break so we can switch out presenters, and Brett has stepped away for a moment?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
What time is it?
Can we make it 5?
Yeah, let's say 7:40. Geez, I said 3 last time.
Last time it was a big old deal.
I was trying to keep
These
it.
2-minute, 3-minute breaks are just fiction anyway.
Just jump.
gavel.
I actually think the public hearing was already closed. I didn't need to gavel.
We're back on air.
I know we are. Internal thoughts, but Chair. All right, let's get moving here, folks. Work session item. So we are moving on to Code Amendment HB 2180 EV Charging Code. The work session item is a discussion of code amendments related to Oregon House Bill 2180, HB 2180, EV Charging Code. Senior Planner Brett Kevlar and Associate Planner Adam Haru will present information about the code amendments for discussion. I invite the presenters to begin.
All right. Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Commissioners, both here and virtually. Brett Kelver, Senior Planner. I'm here with Adam Hiru to go over the first of two work session items with you this evening. I'll do a screen share here. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about some new requirements that have come down from the state regarding charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, which we'll refer to as EVs from here on out. So there were two elements that have been adopted by the state within the last year or two. One of them is House Bill 2180. Another is the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities, or climate friendly rulemaking. Both have elements that relate to requirements that jurisdictions have to adopt within a certain time frame related to EV charging. So a table just kind of gives a quick comparison of the two elements. They do have some similarities, but there are also some things that are a little bit different about them. One of them, the House Bill 2180 rules, actually is already in effect. It did not amend our zoning code, or did not require us to amend our zoning code. It's actually being implemented through the building code. So our building official is, as of July 1st, actually implementing those rules, which we'll explain a little bit more in a bit. The climate-friendly rules are required to be addressed by local jurisdictions by the early part of next year, so by March 31st of 2023, and that's why we're here tonight, to give you a little work session update. We're planning to come back later for a hearing with you, and we've already talked, as we'll discuss later, we've talked with the City Council, but obviously we have to go to them at the end for the final adoption of rules. So both of these sets of requirements relate only to new construction, so that the idea is when new buildings are being built, the rules are intended to make it cheaper and easier for electric vehicle charging in the future. They do both apply to mixed use and multi-family or multi-unit buildings that have at least 5 units or more. And again, we'll discuss that just a little bit more in a second here, but kind of stepping back for a second, just some quick background on a few terms that have come up in our discussion in the staff report, and just so we make sure we're all clear about what we're talking about. There are several different levels of EV charging, and any of you who maybe have some experience with an electric vehicle may be familiar with this already, but for lack of a better phrase, level 1, that's the idea is that you can plug the vehicle into just a standard electrical socket to recharge the vehicle. It's very slow. It takes usually a couple days. All these vary depending on the type of car or the type of vehicle that you're using, but it doesn't require any additional infrastructure. You can simply plug it into any electrical socket. Level 2 is what these requirements that we're addressing with you tonight focuses on. The idea is it's a little bit higher level. It kind of similar to the electrical infrastructure required for like a dryer or an electric stove, so a 240 volt outlet, something that people with an EV might have had installed in their garage or somewhere on their property, so that they can charge their vehicle a little more quickly. Usually, again, it depends on the type of vehicle, but within a few hours, so maybe overnight, you can get the vehicle recharged. And then level 3 is sometimes also referred to as rapid charging. This is what is encountered more kind of as part of our larger infrastructure that we're trying to build as a nation, so that people traveling on highways and between communities in an EV can stop for an hour, maybe tops, and recharge the vehicle to the max capacity allowed by that charger. So it's that's what we're going to hopefully depend on a little bit more as things develop across the larger landscape. And then we're using this phrase EV capable for the requirements that are being set at the state and what we're proposing to adopt into our code. And just to be clear, the idea here is, the understanding is that it is always more expensive to come back to an existing building and have to put in electrical conduit, to have to make space in an electrical panel in order to have the capacity for EV charging. So the idea is you must provide a few basic, like space and conduit for EV charging. It does not mean you're installing a charger. The other two terms that we're working with, EV ready, the idea is it's building upon EV capable. It's additionally including the wiring in that conduit and maybe putting a junction box or some kind of a 240 volt outlet installed, so that if that infrastructure, if EV ready infrastructure is in place, I could pull up to the outlet. I'd have to have my whole cord charger system from home, but I could plug into that and get a more rapid charge. But the other level is EV installed, and the idea there is it's everything. You actually pull up to the space and find a charger that you could probably use an app or somehow pay for. In some cases they're free, but to charge the vehicle. That's more commonly, that's a lot of what we're seeing in that level 3 charging across the country. So just to summarize this piece of it in terms of what is being required by the state, when we look at both of the sets of amendments that have been made at the state level, House Bill 2180 and the climate friendly rules, the result is that we have to require that at least 40% of any new parking spaces that are provided have to be made level 2 capable. Again, not requiring that a charger be installed, but requiring that conduit be installed, ready for wiring, and that there be space at the panel. That is disappointing on one level to people who are wanting to see EV actual infrastructure, to see chargers in communities like Milwaukee. And as Adam will talk to you, we had a similar conversation with the city council, and they had some thoughts and suggestions about that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam and let him tell you a little bit about the conversation we've had with council.
Thank you, Brett. So we talked to City Council on August 16th for a work session, and Council expressed support for two kind of key guiding statements. One is wanting to increase the requirements beyond the climate-friendly and equitable community standards, as well as the HB 2180 standards, and also that compliance options that we develop should prioritize installed chargers. This pretty big chart, I imagine it's quite difficult to read on the slide there, unless you got good vision, but for those viewing on video or for those with the paper copies, Table 4 highlights a few compliance scenarios and provides essentially the estimated number of EV-capable parking spaces that would be created for parking lots of various sizes. The scenarios outlined can be shifted and the values can be tweaked, and the commission may opt to pursue different scenarios for commercial developments than they do for the residential developments. So that's a question for the commission to look at. Scenario 1 on the chart represents the minimum necessary compliance with the rules. Scenarios 2 and 3 would go substantially beyond those minimum requirements, though an applicant may opt to meet a reduced requirement if they provide installed EV chargers at a certain percentage of spaces. It's worth noting that the installed EV chargers would meet the state's EV capable requirement, so any space that has an installed charger would count as EV capable. These scenarios are intended to provide flexibility in compliance and also provide attractive compliance options that do include installed EV chargers. And while what you won't necessarily see reflected here in this chart, so City Council did express support for requiring 100% of spaces be EV capable in smaller parking lots, which is an approach that Portland is taking, where there are 6 or fewer spaces. However, what we have proposed here does not, it kind of is formulated with the purpose of encouraging the installed chargers, so it does allow a lower percentage compliance option.
Can I just jump in to clarify two things that I didn't say as part of the description of the rules that passed? A key element is normally you cannot make rules that go beyond the building code. In this case, the state law, as it was adopted, acknowledged and gave local jurisdictions the ability to require more than the minimum percentage of spaces, but it doesn't allow jurisdictions to require installed chargers instead of the percentage. So part of what's reflected in this table with scenarios 2 and 3 is council's idea that that one way to handle this would be to offer an option. Since the city is allowed to raise the percentage with no limit, council thought, well, maybe if we make it a really high percentage, you can either provide that high percentage, or the alternative is you drop back down to the minimum and provide some installed chargers. So a pretty creative way to address that issue. Thanks, Adam.
Do we want to pause for a second?
Oh,
No, I'll hold it.
So there are some equity considerations that are driving this approach from both the climate-friendly process as well as the HB 2180 legislation. So 80% of EV charging does occur at home. However, homeowners are 3 times more likely to own EVs, and renters often do lack EV charger access at home. So that's a big challenge for renter access, and these rules would apply to and would likely increase EV access for renters because they would apply to buildings being constructed with 5 or more units, which are often rented. And generally speaking, these requirements are not expected to have a very big impact on rent levels. We haven't done our own economic study for the city of Milwaukee, but Portland did some looking into the impact, and they saw that the changes would increase rents less than 1% for new construction. So it's not expected to be a very big impact. And then also having more EVs on the road does reduce local air pollution from traffic emissions, which is another benefit from an equity perspective. So electric vehicles are mentioned in the climate action plan in several different spots. So this first item here is what we're here to do today, implement these electric vehicle ready zoning regulations for commercial buildings and multifamily housing. However, there are several other complementary approaches that the city has committed to undertake at some point. Those are to create a program to install EV charging infrastructure at multi-unit housing complexes. As was noted earlier, these rules really only apply to new construction. So all of the existing multi-unit housing complexes would be left out of this requirement. So there's still room and work to do. Also developing incentives for workplace EV charging. Again, if existing commercial businesses or workplaces, these requirements are not going to apply to them unless they do some significant development. And then also there's an item in there for supporting outreach efforts to encourage the shift to electric vehicles. So these are the key questions for discussion. Does the commission support any of the compliance scenarios outlined or have any beneficial revisions to suggest? And also, does the commission recommend any clarifying amendments to the code that you think would cover any other things that you see need covering?
Are there any are you ready?
I would just say that what we've got on the screen here is just kind of our schedule moving forward. We did have the work session with council on August 16th. We're here tonight for a work session with you. We've got scheduled a hearing with the Planning Commission on October 25th to get your recommendation to carry forward to council. And then we're on the council agenda for November 15th for a hearing and hopeful adoption of the rules. And that's it.
Do commissioners have any clarifying questions for staff?
I do.
Commissioner Heimer?
So what are the new state rules regarding parking?
Well, that is a whole other topic. What's coming, as I understand it, as part of the climate-friendly rules will be more or less the elimination of parking requirements. So what we have crafted with the proposed amendments here is, the idea is, even if required parking goes away, we still anticipate, at least in the near term, developers will recognize that the market and people that they're trying to attract to their buildings will provide some parking. And so we want to be clear with the amendments that when parking for new construction is provided, these rules apply. If in the face of these other state rules that are coming that will eliminate a lot of requirements for parking, we're still going to be able to get the EV infrastructure installed when people actually build it. The point is, if you're building the spaces, you need to make these certain percentages capable.
Stacked parking, right? Like Axle Tree. How does this work with stacked parking?
Yeah, I don't know the technical details of that, but that question has come up, and we have asked and talked to some of our colleagues at Portland and other places and confirmed that that capacity is available and is, in fact, relatively easy. I mean, there's a lot of electricity going into the mechanisms that are moving the stackers around, and so
you could attach a plug to the...
Yeah.
And all we're really talking about is a 120 outlet as the minimum.
Well, no, what we're talking about is the basic infrastructure, so conduit and space on the panel.
Right, but only a 120 volt wire. You're not requiring a 240 volt, you're not requiring...
Well, we're not requiring any wiring. The idea, when I say conduit, I just mean the empty metal or PVC pipe.
The state law, right, gives 3 levels, right? There's the one level that's just a regular plug. Do I understand that right?
No, those level 1, 2, and 3 are not really state mandated things. They're more like what the EV world, I guess, is using to describe.
So when we're looking at this chart, we are assuming a level 2.
Well, and I will say the state law does specifically reference level 2 charging. So it doesn't talk more about level 1 and level 3 and kind of get into a lot of that, but it does specify level 2 charging. So that's why our requirements are focused on level 2. I explained level 1 and level 3 so you could understand what's...
And then when you looked at your economic impact, was that just for the overall price of putting in the conduit, or was that for a shared electric bill between the parking, or did that include an individual meter for how long it's plugged in for?
Yeah, so we didn't do an economic analysis in terms of like for the city of Milwaukee for implementing these, though Portland did in their process for implementing their EV ready regulations, which are not very dissimilar from ours. They did do an economic study, and it did take into account in the case of the level 2, just the capacity or space at the panel. So either you've got the capacity installed or you have room for the capacity in the future in the panel. And you've got the raceway and the conduit, which is just really ultimately the tubes that the wires will one day go in.
So it didn't take a shared electric bill for the parking that got transferred over, or it did not take in some sort of metered pay parking, right?
Right, I think at this point there's maybe an assumption that there may be several different ways that building owners or developers handle this. Some may choose to provide free electricity to their tenants. Others may contract or make some arrangement with a company that does EV installation so that they're kind of like leasing their machines, and I would pull in, and pay myself. So I think there are several different ways it could be handled. So.
Okay.
Others?
I have one.
Commissioner Massey?
Yeah, although I like the idea of flexibility, I question if the goal is to provide more EV charging capability, why we would have the option to do a 20% full-on installation versus an 80% backbone installation. Because from my way of thinking, if you build the backbone, the infrastructure, it's eventually going to get a charger. I don't know. I'm just, this is just a rhetorical question. I mean, you know, if someone has an ability to sort of do the 20% and walk away from it, then you got 20%, you may never get the other 80. But my thought process is if you put in the infrastructure for 80% or whatever the percentage is, I don't know, my gut feeling is you'll eventually get the whole thing for 80%. I mean, is that part of the discussion? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm asking.
Yeah, I could, you want to?
Yeah, sure. So when we talked with City Council, the mayor and several of the councilors expressed a preference for getting installed chargers in the shorter term. I think, you know, the market, it's hard to separate what the market is going to demand and whether these things are just going to happen on their own or whether our rules are actually going to be the reason why they get installed. In the much shorter term, it seems like not as many, you know, maybe not as many chargers are going to get installed in the very short term. So I think that was kind of the thinking behind it, is that in the more short term.
Yeah, I mean,
getting those
you
installed.
could envision a scenario where 20% of the development has chargers and the other 80% says, why don't I have a charger? I don't know. I don't know the answer here. That's why I'm asking these questions. Yeah.
I had a clarifying question for staff. Maybe if we could just go back to the table. I was probably looking at it before I'd had my second cup of coffee this morning and was just hoping you might be able to choose, you know, maybe scenario 3 and just talk us through it. I'm pretty sure I grasp it, but I think spending a few minutes talking about it could be useful.
I seem to have momentarily lost control of the presentation. Yeah, bear with me a moment. No.
Maybe reshare.
Adam spent a lot of time with this chart, so I'm sure he can walk you through it.
It's gone through a lot of changes.
Complex, one of the more complex I've seen in a while. And again, the font size.
Yeah, it's a tough one to fit on a slide, for sure. It's on, I think, an 11 by 17 in the staff report.
Maybe we even just start with the option in the lower right corner, which it seems like is where council was providing some initial direction towards staff. So could you talk us through kind of that scenario 3 in the lower right corner?
Yeah, so that would be for residential developments with 5 or more dwelling units. So that's when that would trigger, that provide parking. They could choose to pursue option A, which is 100% of all of the parking spaces that they provide are EV capable for a eventual level 2 installation, charger installation, or they can opt to meet a reduced requirement of 50% of those spaces being EV capable. And of that 50%, 15% of those would have to have an installed charger. As we mentioned before, we cannot require an installed charger because of the building code. It would count as sort of preempting the building code, and so we'd have to pursue a local amendment process to do that. However, we can provide 2 different compliance options, and one which sort of prioritizes and puts a little extra emphasis on the value of installed chargers. Those 15% of those chargers would count toward the 50%. So because the state building code rule is really clear that installed chargers count toward the EV capable requirement.
So, and just by extension, kind of residential dwelling with 10 spots, they'd have to put in conduit and save space in the breaker box. That would be path A, 100% compliance, or they could then opt to say, put in conduit and save space in the breaker box for 5 potential chargers, but one of those spots, they would need to install a charger and then they'd be compliant.
And it would be 2 for the.
2, sorry.
And unlike other parking rules, the EV infrastructure requirements are a no less than percentage. So while we may round down in other parking requirements, we actually round up in electric vehicle infrastructure, sort of like EV capable spaces.
Thanks for taking time to talk through that. I appreciate it. And I think I like council's direction on this. I think setting a high bar and then creating an alternative compliance pathway will probably help us get towards our goals a lot faster. So that's just kind of my own perspective. I have some other questions, but I'll hold in case anybody else would like to talk on this.
I'm going to ask, just continue if
Sure,
you would
yeah.
with your other questions,
So,
Commissioner Sherman.
Great. I think my other, these are probably more comments, just as you're working on this. I myself am working on some electric vehicle code work right now. And I would encourage staff to just think about defining electric vehicles perhaps more broadly than just automobiles. There are electric tricycles, electric scooters, electric bikes. All these are vehicles in a state vehicle classification sort of way. In fact, e-bikes were actually the #1 selling electric vehicle in the world in 2020, more than electric automobiles. So these are just some definitional issues that I'm kind of thinking about myself and would encourage you to think about it. The other thing that I think I feel pretty strongly about and would hope that staff would take a little bit of time to look at other pieces of code that might need to change. And so I'm thinking specifically about our bicycle parking requirements in Chapter 19609, where we have our requirements with development for covered or enclosed bike parking. And I think in those facilities, we should probably add a requirement for an outlet so that people choosing to use electric bikes have a way to charge up their electric bike in those secure bike parking facilities. So we're not just providing the charging for electric automobiles in the parking lot, but also maybe in those bike facilities, also providing an outlet or two.
Thank you, Commissioner Sherman. I'll just agree that I hadn't thought about the definition, and I think that makes a lot of sense and something we would then otherwise have to address. I also like the way that council is moving towards that option in the bottom right-hand side to try and get greater EV capacity in a shorter period of time. Giving people some options, I think, is a good way of doing that, knowing that parking regulation is coming down the pipe at some point. Yeah, I would generally just support that direction. Anyone else?
Chair, can I see the slide about the equity slide?
Yes.
That we went through? Okay, I don't know if I had maybe a couple comments and questions or things I would think about. As far as like the EV charging and these minimum standards, how it affects maybe some of the low housing. There's a major push to get more housing in Milwaukee. And if we're asking builders to put in these EV charging, is that going to deter, some of the building for these low income housing? I think someone mentioned that maybe the cost wouldn't go up as much, but I don't know any business that doesn't really push down costs to the end user, to the client. So I think that would, something we should kind of keep in mind. I know these are, this is for new buildings and stuff like that. And those are probably going to be, the renters are probably going to be on a higher income level than some of the lower income residents, but I don't know. I want to just keep in mind that, if we're talking about housing, it's going to affect housing across the board, not just people who are buying these, renting the mixed use and the higher income renters. This is going to affect lower income renters as well. And the lower income renters don't tend to buy or can't afford to buy EV vehicles. I think those were my comments.
I'd like to second that comment. I think that's really pertinent. And, really when, I appreciate the equity considerations that we're seeing that, we're trying to expand access to EV charging for renters, but we also need to be cognizant of, when we do have a development that is perhaps, for lower income, or at a lower end of the market, that, maybe there should be options for compliance, or maybe we, vary the minimum compliance, because even if it's new development for, a low end of the income spectrum, it's still new development. They still, have to comply. And while I appreciate that, there would probably be less parking in a, lower income development period, there is still an impact. And quite honestly, who are we really helping in that case? Because, as Commissioner Freeman said, lower income households are not owning, fancy new electric vehicles. So if they own a private vehicle at all, I think that is a really, really good consideration. I thank you for bringing that up, Commissioner Freeman.
Commissioner Freeman, do you have a recommendation on we use this 20, 40, 60, 80 percentile of the medium to help describe affordability or rates that those are set at to be able to serve those residents. Do you have a suggestion at what that percentage should be under medium household income?
I don't have a direct suggestion, but I just wanted to have some discussion to make sure that we're just, we're looking at all the renters or, case users across the spectrum. I don't want to just focus on, people who are buying high-end EV vehicles. So
I appreciate Commissioner Freeman's observation there. And I think thinking about some sort of alternative path for regulated affordable housing, I'll maybe underscore the word regulated there. So I don't want just somebody saying, oh yeah, my rents are going to be cheap, and using that as an opportunity to kind of, skirt compliance. So I think I think it's a smart thing to think about. Also want to note for the commission, it might be worth just Googling a little bit. I know one of our fellow commissioners, I think, is somewhat in the process of potentially purchasing an electric vehicle, but there are a lot of rebates out there, and there are extra rebates at the state level for low-income individuals, and those rebates are generally taken up at a lower rate. But those rebates can also be used to purchase a used vehicle or lease a vehicle. So I know some people that have personally gone out and scored an electric vehicle for a very reasonable amount of money. Not to say, again, everybody's out trying to buy a car, but there are a lot of incentives out there. So I do think we should be thinking about it in this space.
I would be perfectly comfortable with us recommending to City Council, scenario 3. And then, but with, hey, if you're building housing that is supposed to take 60% below the medium income, that you are not required to do this. It could be 80. I guess 80% probably holds onto their cars more than anybody else. But there is that sliding scale that falls down, and I know Commissioner Edge, Vice Chair Edge, has it probably inside his head that he could tell us what those numbers are. But I'd be comfortable, yeah, if the housing was to serve 60% of the median household income, you understand what I mean by that? By putting some sort of parameter on it?
Sure, I'd maybe defer to staff to figure out what that percentage should be. Maybe 80% would make more sense, but I think, putting a area median income kind of target on it is probably the good way of thinking about it.
He's even stepping it down from, like there's a certain reduction at 80%, if it's 60% NFI, another reduction. You know, I mean, what I would be interested in is seeing what our options are based on the data. And what I mean by the data is, you know, the ownership data for the different, you know, MFI, you know, tiers. And so if we are actually able to pull some data and say, oh, there's, you know, a 3% adoption rate at the 80% MFI, then, you know, versus at 120% MFI, it's, you know, closer to 15 or 20% adoption rate, you know, whatever. You know, so seeing how that's broken down and seeing what the likely, who you know, if there is a regulated, you know, income development, looking at the number of units that are being provided at the income restricted levels, and then comparing that to the data to see what the actual ownership rate or adoption rate, you know, whatever is, and just making sure that if we're going to require this infrastructure to get built, that it's going to serve its intended purpose and that it will actually end up getting used. That's what I would be advocating for. And I appreciate Commissioner Hemer's confidence in my ability to recall numbers at a whim, but I honestly would prefer to defer to staff or for future discussion in looking at actual ownership and adoption data by income level, if that makes sense.
I agree with Vice Chair's assessment. I think that's what I was trying to get at, was to try to come up with a way so that, and staff made the point that, hey, these buildings are going to be around for 100 years. So I'm not going to want to say that every lower income individual that's living in these places for the next 100 years is not going to have an EV vehicle. But I recognize that there is an added on expense, especially when you're going to start metering these things, or if you're going to share the electric bill throughout the building. So I would like to see some sort of threshold or peel back for a bona fide lower income.
And I think I just wanted to add, I think we can look into that. I think the only caveat that I would add is I want to dig into it and ask some other jurisdictions about what they're doing, because it's a double-edged sword. Like, I don't want to not install or not require EVs so that then we're precluding low-income folks from having EV cars.
See, I mean, that's the catch-22.
Right, it's a catch-22. So we'll do a little bit of research, see if we can find out a little bit more, understand it. And Adam, you may know, I don't know if Portland's doing anything like this.
So the reality is we cannot vary lower than the minimum compliance. So even in the most, like the highest requirement scenario, we're looking at, let's say in a 10-space parking lot, we're looking at one more EV capable space, and then potentially 2 chargers more in that like 10-space example. And those residential EV chargers cost something like $900, or it varies. It very much varies. There's many different kinds that utilize the 240 volt outlet, but on the scale of the larger project, and then it doesn't add up to that much money. So you'd be creating a variance for a pretty small amount of savings, if that makes sense. In a smaller parking lot example, if it's a 100-space parking lot or something, then it's going to be, you know, a much more substantial chunk of money. But the difference between that 50 and that 40% isn't going to be that many spaces for the scale of most of the developments that we see in Milwaukee.
Yeah, it's just mostly about the bigger developments, I think. And I think that that's an interesting conversation. It might be worth our time to reach out to some affordable housing developers and see kind of like how they're thinking about it, like what their take on it is, if they would prefer to see some sort of higher level, something that's more in line with all of the rest of our code, or if they would see the other side of it and that they would like to see it be a minimum compliance thing. I guess so. I'd like to just have some more conversations and come back to you all with a better idea.
Yeah, and
It's tricky.
Maybe I hate to kind of augur on this a little, but, you know, maybe another piece could also be is after you get that first charger actually installed, maybe a developer could have an option for a fee in lieu, and that could go into a pot of money to help subsidize the affordable housing development, building it out. Who knows? Maybe that's a horrible idea. Probably is. You'll tell us next time we talk about this.
Yeah, and when we talked with city council, the mayor was referencing a lot of the federal dollars that have been, there's still, it's going to take some time for those to trickle down to jurisdictions, but the conversation around incentives and trying to figure out how to provide chargers in places where they wouldn't otherwise be, and that may be a good place to talk about, chargers for, are there resources for that?
Other comments or questions from commissioners? All right.
I actually have one question that might help us looking ahead to the October 25th hearing, and that is, let me just share again, regarding the table. If you look at the scenario 1 row, you see the minimum requirement, and as Adam noted, we can't establish rules that go lower than this. So that means no lower than 20% for commercial development and no lower than 40% for residential. Beyond that, I guess I would encourage you to keep in mind, and it might be good to get your feedback on this, you can mix and match across the scenarios. You could choose for residential development to go with that lower right-hand corner that you're talking about, scenario 3, a really high percentage of EV-capable spaces or installed chargers, and let commercial development stick with the minimum, 20%. We didn't really ask that question of council, and it's one that I guess I'm just curious to see, recognizing that, again, part of what we mentioned in the equity slide, for example, was, there's a note that it's, with the level 2 charging, it's something that can be done kind of overnight. And so if at the place that I live, I can charge my vehicle overnight, that's a benefit to me. And I think the way the rules are written, requiring that higher percentage as a minimum for residential than commercial, is a recognition that, employees who are showing up at their place of business, or maybe me if I'm showing up to a place to shop and do business, it would be nice to be able to plug my EV in. If I'm only going to be there for an hour or so, that may not help me a whole lot. If I'm working there and I'm there all day, that might help a lot. But I guess all that to say, I'd be interested to get your take on whether you think we should require, higher percentages for commercial development as well as residential, and understand you can mix and match from these two groups. So either food for thought for tonight that we can return to at the hearing, or if anyone has an off-the-cuff thought, it'd be interesting to hear what your response is.
And why didn't we include something for single-family dwellings as well?
Well, the state law is pretty clear about setting the threshold at requiring this for residential that's 5 units or above. I don't know that, I guess we can't.
can.
State law didn't
It's state,
change
yeah.
it, so it's, localities are still preempted by the state building code on
Yep.
smaller, less than 5 units.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I think having a toggled difference between residential and commercial makes sense. What's the mix, I think, is the question. I think the research on electric vehicle charging, based on what's happening now, is most people charge at home. That's the #1 spot. And the second spot is at work. So I do think that there's probably, it makes sense there. What's the percentage? That's a really good question. And also, what's the percentage moving forward into the future, right? Because the research now is based on today and those early adopters, not necessarily the future consumers. So, I don't really have a strong opinion on it other than that, but it's a good question.
And I think, it's a changing field all the time, right? It's evolving. We're kind of like at the beginning of it. So it's kind of like we're going to do our best to get it right, and knowing that we're probably going to have to come in and get it right again, change it again in the future. And I would just think that if you were going to have, the goal is to have more charging regardless of where it is, period. That would be, you would want people to have those options, I would think, just more.
Yeah, I think I admire what council was thinking on this, because I think the opportunity to actually provide chargers on the ground now is how you send the market signal to everyday folks that you don't have to worry about range anxiety and you don't have to worry about where to charge because you just start to see chargers. So that's what I think I like about setting a really high standard and then creating this alternative compliance path that helps us maybe get some chargers built out.
Okay, I think you have enough feedback. Brett, Adam, thank you.
I was just going to throw in an extra comment that I just wanted to support that. I guess I don't have strong feelings about this, but if we were going to, do as, Brett was suggested and have kind of, 2 different tracks for residential or commercial, absolutely would want more in residential. And frankly, I'd be comfortable with minimum compliance for commercial. Quite frankly, I just don't see the benefits to having these slow chargers at grocery stores or, salons or, whatever, workplaces. I guess I kind of get it, but is that, I don't know. I don't feel like the commercial locations are the right place for these generally, and so I don't see a need to build out a whole lot of infrastructure in commercial parking lots for charging. But residential, this makes sense.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on then to the downtown design review. Work session item is a discussion of code amendments related to the downtown design review. Senior Planner Brett Kevler will present information about the code amendments for discussion.
All right. Thank you again. Item 2 for your work session agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about downtown design review, following up on the work session that we had on August 9th. So what we're hoping to get out of the session this evening is we're looking ahead to a hearing for this item as well. So October 25th is going to have, we're hoping to have hearings for both of the items that we're discussing tonight, EV charging and also the downtown design review. So we want to just cover some of the items that we discussed at the August 9th meeting. I know not all the commissioners were able to be at that, and so I thought it would be good to kind of recap that a little bit and see if there's additional thinking or discussion to be had. And just, again, like with the EV thing, just see what else we need to try to address in order to be ready for a hearing on October 25th. So as a quick recap of the universe that we're dealing with, there are 3 sections of the code that deal with downtown development and design. Some of the standards are focused on, very physical aspects of the building, setbacks, floor area ratio, that kind of thing. There's another section that deals more with actual design. And then there's the kind of the steering wheel part of it, the part that talks about the process, the review process, and what triggers review, what doesn't. The document that we're currently working with is separate from the zoning code. It's a downtown design guidelines document that was adopted in the early 2000s, and it identifies some design elements that don't completely match with the ones that are in the code itself. And part of the work that was done by the DLC, the Design and Landmarks Committee, focused on an assessment of the gaps, trying to identify mismatches or gaps between those elements that are listed in that separate design guidelines document and the elements listed in our code. And some of the things that were identified were that it just wasn't always clear when guidelines should apply to a certain project. The applicant might have one idea, staff might have another idea, and the reviewers and decision makers might have a third. And there was some recognition that there are some things that are currently not considered design standards, they're actual development standards, but some of those things actually do affect the design. And so again, for the last couple of years, the DLC has been working on trying to pull together a package of proposed amendments here, and specifically looking at these 3 sections of the code, 19.304, 508, and 907, with the intent being to try to better align the standards for design with the guidelines so that when there's a more discretionary path required or chosen by an applicant, that it's more clear for the applicant and the reviewers and decision makers how to come to some decision about whether the project is approvable. And along the way, the effort as proposed would involve just simply repealing that separate downtown design guidelines document. So to take it out of play and to pull the essential elements of it into the zoning code so everything is kind of more in one place. So some of the specific suggestions and changes include shifting a few of what I mentioned are development standards for downtown into the design standards section. Some of this involves expanding the design elements that are in the 19.508 section from 7 to 14, and just trying to clarify that doesn't necessarily make it more complicated. It's actually the intent is to make it more clear, that people can find themselves more easily about what elements are they supposed to be addressing, and there's less vagueness. One specific recommendation from the DLC is that multifamily development, which currently has the option of choosing whether to use the downtown design review process for a multifamily project downtown, or it can use the general multifamily standards in 19.505.3. The suggestion was, look, there's already a lot of similarities between those two. It's really important for the fabric, the design fabric that these rules are intended to establish, to treat multifamily buildings the same way. Part of what's involved with that, as we'll note, is that the state law requires that multifamily as a housing type needs to have the option, a very clear option, to go through a clear and objective process so that it can show its meeting standards and it's approved. And so we have a suggestion for that. And then along the way, one of the early ideas in general about this whole update started in part with a desire to just update and refresh the graphics. And so some of that is being done with the proposed amendments as well. So just to highlight a few of the things that were addressed at the August 9th meeting and that were covered briefly in the staff report. One suggestion, this is the excerpt here is from the 19.907 part of the code, what establishes the process, which things require which level of design review. There was a recognition that there are certain activities that are in this list that don't have any standards. And so the idea is, how or why are we requiring people to go through a review process for things that there's nothing really to review them against? And there was a little bit of discussion. I think you wanted to be careful and clear about making sure that there wasn't something that maybe should have some standards, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But that was the general idea here in an effort to clean that up. There was a note that with respect to the recent changes that you were involved with for the moderate density, the middle housing code, it was recognized that now in the RMD zone, the moderate density zone, the minimum density for townhouses is 25 units. And the idea was, why shouldn't it be at least the same number in the downtown, which is intended to be a more dense place? So we view this as a little bit just of a kind of a housekeeping amendment there. There was a suggestion to eliminate the discrepancy that has caused a small problem on one or two occasions where a project is actually going to meet the standard building height standard for feet or for stories, but not the other. So one or the other. And the suggestion was to eliminate the stories aspect of measuring building height and focus on feet. I think one of the commissioner's suggestions was, well, but that's not everyone can, envision how many stories might be in a building of certain feet height. And I think our response or thought about that is a really good point. I think staff has the ability, and all the materials that we provide, staff report and our presentation discussion, we can align those and say it's a 45-foot tall building, AKA 5 stories or whatever it would be. There were a few items that seemed to warrant a little more discussion, and one that we wanted to clarify was kind of lines up with that suggestion to if you're in agreement that it's recommended to make multifamily buildings be subject to only the downtown design review standards and make sure that they have a type 1 option if they meet the standards, it raises the question of, well, if I'm a non-multifamily building and I meet the standards, why can't I go through the type 1 process as well? There's what discretion is there to be exercised for this? And so the suggestion was to consider, for at least for new development or substantial additions or redevelopment of buildings downtown, to simply have a clear and objective type 1 process or a more discretionary type 3 process. And I'll just roll through these and we can come back for discussion.
I'm sorry, Brett,
Yeah.
but aren't all buildings in the DMU actually supposed to be mixed use?
No. An example would be the Henley Place building on the Kellogg Bowl site is residential only.
All right.
Yeah. So there are some areas where you can have residential only. It doesn't have to be a mixed use building.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the majority of it is mixed use,
Well,
right?
and in fact, I think, based on Vera Colias, her mention before when you were asking the question about the L and the limited use, I think there are probably some Ls in the DMU for, small manufacturing or production. I think, it doesn't necessarily have to be a full mixed use building or residential only. I think I'd have to double check, but I think some of those Ls point to some of that limited other uses.
Got it. Thank you.
One question that the DLC wanted to get your opinions about was an item that has, again, in a couple of cases, been a little bit of a speed bump for some projects, and that is the requirement for buildings that exceed the base maximum building height, as is allowed by the code if, for example, you're providing residential or lodging use on one floor, or if the building is a green building through one of our certified accepted processes. The current requirement is that the building be stepped back at least 6 feet. There have been several cases where the project has had to go through the discretionary type review in order to address that standard because they weren't providing that step back. In those cases, there has not seemed to be any real issue or concern about that from the commission or the public comments or testimony in those. So, but with that in mind, I guess one suggestion was to consider either just maintaining the current standard to require the step back if there's some discomfort about this, or to perhaps reduce the requirement a little bit to just require that step back for maybe half of the frontage of the building. I think I didn't address this fully in the staff report, but I think our recommendation would be, I guess, depending on your consideration discussion, would be to either just choose to keep the requirement if you can't come to some agreement about it being okay to let it go, or just to delete it entirely. With some of this evidence that we've had several buildings that have come by that have provided no step back, and the other design features that they've been provided in the process they've gone through has seemed to, give us buildings that aren't presenting a massing problem that can be addressed in some other way. So we can come back and discuss that, but I just wanted to touch on that item. There was also some discussion about, this lines up with the review process, and that if you are building a new building and you agree to let that building go through type 1 review, our current code doesn't require any public notice. There's no public hearing. There's no requirement for notifying folks that this new building is coming. And so there were some thoughts and questions from the commission about, are there some alternatives to that? And I think that what the staff's current thinking on this is that, we're open to your discussion, but I think we can see maybe rather than codifying a requirement for public notice for type 1 buildings, that we would just make it a practice to say, here's how we're going to do it. When we see a new building in downtown, if it's going through type 1 review, even though there's no requirement for public notice, which wouldn't actually include a requirement for or an opportunity for any meaningful change. The idea is it would simply be saying, a building's been proposed, it appears to meet all the standards, you're being notified just so that you know. It's not a discretionary decision. So that's our current thought about that. Again, we can return to that. In addition, Commissioner Heemer, you raised a couple of issues related to the EV charging issue, which we've discussed a little bit earlier in the other work session about requiring green buildings and a requirement for public art. So we weren't sure if there were other issues that had come up in the meantime as you've had a little more time maybe to look at the requirements or the proposed amendments. But I think with that, I just have outlined the schedule here. We're looking to get back to you on October 25th for a hearing, going to the council for a work session on this item on November 1st. So shortly after, just the week after we have the hearing with you, and then trying to get to council in early December for a hearing. If everything stays on track. So with that in mind, I guess I'd say that's our presentation. If you want to go back and touch on any of these issues that we've highlighted or some other ones you've come up with, would like to hear how you can help us get ready for October 25th.
May I ask a question, Chair?
Yes.
Chair, could we go back to the step back?
Yes, that's the one I'd like to talk about as well.
To me, 6 feet is not that much of a step back to begin with. And so I'm really concerned about a partial step back on 50% of the frontage.
So here's my take on it. Is what has happened is that every time that somebody walks in here and complains about the step back, they say, well, it hinders our economic development of this building. And so what they have come up with is an alternative pattern change. Some sort of change in the building so that it gives the illusion that the building itself is not just this monstrosity of a wall. And we've accepted it 4 or 5 times over. What my question is that how do you codify that into a type 1 process code so that that is actually ensured that's what's happening if you get rid of the step back? Go ahead.
Yeah, you wouldn't be, I guess. I think you'd be depending on the other standards related to building mass, to horizontal and vertical articulation to do some of that work. So yeah, by taking the step back requirement out, I think the thinking is that there are enough other elements or requirements in the code to address that.
Can you be more specific? Because I don't think it does.
Yeah,
I guess as I recall, it does not. It was always up to the individual applicant to defend how they were equal.
I can't give specific examples, but I think that's the sense we were working with, was that the overall construction of the standards since the projects that have come through have been able to demonstrate that they're
Right, but not required by code.
Right.
They did it to break code, to get a variance off of the code. And so that means that our code does not have this written in breakup of design in it. And so I would like to see what that really, really looks like. Because the concern when all of this whole DMU thing started was the residents of Milwaukee didn't want these big, huge, tall, stark buildings. And I don't hear the residents complaining about the new buildings that are being built. And it's not because they don't have step back, but it's because it has architectural differences at that spot where that step back should be. And so however that is, I'm okay with letting the step back go as long as I know that those architectural differences are quantified and qualified so that it goes through that type 1 review.
So I have a question for staff, I think. And maybe this isn't practical to do, but I've never really understood the step back thing in practicality, and so what I'm concerned about is we are taking space away from somebody. And so what if we have as the standard, because again, I appreciate Commissioner Hemer's concerns here, if we completely remove the standard, then we don't have the insurance that we're going to get some creative response in return to making sure that it doesn't have that bulky appearance, that blocky, bulky appearance that we're concerned about. So what if the standard were, you've got the step back along the whole frontage, but you can take that space and stack it on the other side. And then the variance would be, I don't want to do that. I want to make it all just lower and the same uniform shape, but I'm going to do this design thing instead.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Edge, could you repeat that? I missed the first part of that.
Take the space that we're saying you can't have right now under the step back standard, take that floor area and put it elsewhere in the development, even if it means going over the height.
Oh.
No,
The maximum height standard.
I get what he's saying, but I get it.
Yeah, I guess I would
The idea is
be
you-
concerned about that as a path for potentially additional stories, additional height that we would then be allowing.
Are we concerned about height or are we concerned about blockiness?
Well, both. But I think the setback is intended to reduce the appearance of mass
The
and to
bulkiness.
make it more scalable to the pedestrian. And also in relationship to views. So I think
And
adding
so
an
if the height,
additional story
if
to
that
that.
floor area went elsewhere, you would still get the breakup and the diversity of, shape and massing on the structure.
But then the building would get taller and would block greater view.
On one part of the building.
Well, but still. I guess that's the concern I see, because generally we're trying to cap the height of that building. And then one way in allowing it for that additional story is to include some type of step back so that the mass, the appearance of the building's general mass is reduced as the building gets taller.
Chair.
And so I think that on that slide, I think there's this, I can't see what letter it is, if it's G or what, but it says breaking up the material basically at the head of the building from differentiating it from the base. But it only calls out material, and I'm asking if you could pull up the slide. It only differentiates in material. And I think, for example, axletree, it wasn't just the material, but we had this added kind of dimensional element that stepped away from the building's facade and gave the appearance of that kind of step back. So I think, yeah, G, a change in material or cladding from the ground floor. I guess there's just no avenue, as Commissioner Huebner is saying, is there's no avenue for the code to require then some type of distinguishing architectural kind of element that would give the equal appearance of breaking up the building as a step back does do.
I'll have to look more carefully at it. I mean, there are requirements to provide a distinct base, middle, and top of the building that don't necessarily have to have a step back or don't include the step back requirement. The step back piece is in the building massing and transitions section of things. I mean, I think one way we could handle this is to kind of take the points, the concern that there's some discomfort with removing the step back requirement if there can't be a demonstration that there are other requirements in place that you would have to meet if you're going through the type 1 review that would achieve the same effect. I think that's fair. And I think our recommendation be that if it seems like that is not the case, then rather than going to a partial requirement for only 50% of the frontage, just to keep it the way that it is. I think the idea was to potentially remove one more barrier that might push someone unnecessarily into a type 3 review if it seemed like that issue could and was being addressed with other requirements that are in the code. So I think we could look more into that and
Chair,
come
before
ready.
we move on.
Yeah.
So just my own edification, can you give me examples where these variations were employed?
So Axletree is probably the best building, and now I got to remember.
Go back to the sketch, will you? It's on.
Oh, yeah.
Making Brett click
Please.
the card.
But it does the brick, and then it. So it created this eave up over the top, around the building kind of deal. So it looked like that it was actually stepped back, so that when you stood at the building, it didn't seem as tall.
Well, I think actually one of the more important pieces is the kind of framing of a series of units that you're seeing kind of on the left-hand side of the building in that sketch, which give the appearance that those elements are actually projecting from the building and gives them the appearance that the top level is actually stepping back when in reality they're all aligned. So it's just that kind of play is not a material-based kind of language. It's more of the actual push and play physically on these specific elements. The axle tree, they were, through a number of different conversations, they were able to come to this kind of middle ground with us where we said, okay, we're willing to acknowledge that the 6-foot step back is a hindrance because of economic reasons, like you mentioned, but here's what we've done instead. And we've added this additional kind of framing and push and play on the facade and the building's materials to emphasize this middle section versus the top and distinguish the building that way. However, that was something they came up with as an alternative to the 6-foot step back that would not have been required if you were to just read the code verbatim. And I think that's the issue I see in removing it.
Yeah, fair enough.
And it's the additional 2 stories that causes the issue. So the green building and the residential bonus story that you get. If it's only 3 stories and it's just 3 stories, that over time has not really ever raised an issue. It's those additional stories, and that was part of the compromise to adding these 2 extra bonuses for getting what we wanted. And I guess what we're trying to avoid is kind of something that you see as those, residential only buildings, especially in the core. Maybe you're not so worried about it to the north, but you are certainly more worried about it in the core of, between Harrison and Washington.
Well, isn't this an argument to keep the code as it is? Because it appears that Axletree achieved the results that were desired. And if we try to monkey with the code to try to define the Axletree process, we're just going to get wrapped around them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the suggestion, at least that I am making, is to keep the code as it is, because we do not have any other avenue in order to allow for creative thinking from a design team and developer to come up with something like the. And I think that I would want that to go through a type 3 review through this process so that we could look at it and say that is equal.
Yeah. Understood. Yeah, that's helpful feedback. That's exactly what we're looking for.
Except the big problem is that just through real life experience, we know that the step back creates uneconomical feasibility.
Right.
So
I don't know about.
I don't
I don't
agree with that,
uneconomical.
and we've never actually pushed anybody to kind of
Prove it, see
verify.
their
I mean,
pro forma,
everything is an
yeah.
economic burden.
I know.
right?
Yeah, I hear you.
So when that came up on Axletree, I kind of was pushing back on that, but
even Coho, we went through Coho, their design created a creative kind of alternative idea to be able to keep those units and
it got us, I think, to a better outcome. And I think maintaining some of that. I think the other thing that I was thinking about is, some of the projects we've approved recently still haven't been built. And once they are built, community members might have a different feeling. So if we just took some of these took this and threw it out right now, that might be a decision we might regret in, a year or 2 from now. So I think
that's fair.
I think maintaining kind of the approach makes sense on this question.
okay. Should we talk
While
about
we're
some
on
of the other
this
points?
slide,
Say again?
yeah, I was just gonna say, while we're on this slide, with the type 1 versus type 3, I wanted to bring up a procedure alternative suggestion, which would be that, that these would go through a type 2 review with staff and a design and landmarks committee consultation process to go through the guidelines reviews. And then if there was an appeal, then that could come through the planning commission and we would look at it in a more policy oriented view. But really, because again, I think that where these projects are succeeding is in the work with the design and landmarks committee. And being able to not force all of these through the type 3 process, which is really, expensive and lengthy. I don't think that we're providing the benefit for that process as the Planning Commission. I think that the DLC is providing that benefit for the type 3 reviews. And so if that was to change to be a type 2 with a staff decision, but with that DLC consult, which I realize would be an amended process compared to what we have now, but really to allow the DLC the opportunity to weigh in and give their advice to staff and allow staff to make that first level decision. I would really like that change in process. I think that would offer greater value to these projects and still achieving the same desirable outcomes that we are saying that we like.
I feel like we've talked about this before, or at least something similar, and the challenge has been that the DLC is not a commission.
Yeah.
And so although
We're not giving them the decision. We're not giving the DLC the decision-making authority. We're giving the DLC involvement, in a type 2 staff decision, planning director decision process. And that's what type 2 is for some discretion, with the guidelines, but this would be allowing the DLC to make the recommendations to staff and, to have that dialogue like they would on the type 3, but it would just go to staff instead of us. So it is a different process, but it would leverage, I think, the true value of these processes has been the DLC's involvement.
And in that case, then we can include the historic NDA as well with that same rationale.
I don't think you can require that.
Well, that's
Not for type 1.
That's been suggested. I think, right now, the DLC in a type 3 process, the code does require the DLC to have a public meeting. And I think we'd probably want to suggest that if we chose this type 2 route that Commissioner Edge was suggesting, that there probably be a public meeting of the DLC. And I guess this question of involving the NDA is, related but separate.
Separate, yeah.
But-
Let's talk about it separately.
So that would increase the number of cases that the DLC then has the opportunity to review?
Well, no, it'd be the same number. I mean, if it stays type 3, they're involved anyway. And that same, what would have been a type 3 project that gets dropped to type 2, they're going to deal with it anyway, if we write it that way.
But I guess maybe a concern with that proposal would be, then if anybody submits an appeal, then you just end up in the place that you might have ended up anyways. And it just seems you might be creating an expectation with an applicant that just isn't going to get met because somebody decides to appeal and then they have to end up somewhere else. I don't know. I'm kind of
Well, today that appeal would be heard by City Council.
Right.
And with a type 2, the appeal would be heard by the Planning Commission. And so they can still appeal our decisions if it's a type 3. It just suddenly now the City Council has to get involved and be the final arbiter.
Yeah, maybe I'm just wondering.
So that would be.
That hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. I guess maybe I'm just wondering, is it broke and do we need to fix it?
Yeah, that's the big question.
I think we're pretty busy. I think we have, we are generally a pretty busy body, and the City Council is a pretty busy body. And I think that delegating some of these to, basically allowing these to be a type 2 where it's planning director decision, but allowing that public meeting with the DLC and allowing the public process involved with that, I think we're still getting the benefit out of it without making it as involved of a process for the city and for the applicants.
What if you don't have the number of people on the DLC that you need in order to have the hearing?
Yeah, you mean like a quorum?
Well, it's not really a hearing.
Well, but they do need to have a quorum to be able to conduct official business. So it's a relevant question.
And the committee, the terms of a committee are different than the terms of a commission, and it's just a whole other thing. I guess I see more problems with this, Vice Chair Edge, than I do benefit. And I guess
I guess I don't see the difference between that and what we do now.
I guess my sense is that I place as much value in our review of these things as I do in some of the code amendment changes that we're making in terms of the impact on our community. And I would rather be more involved in that process than less involved. I think there's some potential pitfalls to leaving it type 2s through the DLC.
We'd have to look as well at the timing requirements for type 2 procedure, because right now they're pretty tight. The idea is that once the application is deemed complete, we, within 7 days, have to refer it for comment. We have to send out the public notice and then allow at least 2 weeks. I suppose we could drag that out a little bit. I mean, we can't issue a decision before at least 2 weeks have passed for comment. We can take longer, just recognizing that we have to keep an eye on the 120-day clock and not allow so much time. So it might actually be difficult to squeeze in a DLC meeting within 2 weeks of 2 to 3 weeks of getting an application
To be
deemed
fair, though,
complete.
I think those are our own self-imposed deadlines, though, Brett, so.
But yeah, it's just they're in the code. So we might need to specify that maybe for this process, the type 2 thing works a little different, or I don't know. We'd have to look at that and see. That could get a little complicated, but.
Maybe on the,
I just don't see that there's necessarily a technical benefit to having the first hearing be before the planning commission with, the appeal being to city council versus having the first decision being rendered by the planning director and an appeal being heard by the planning commission. If the community was concerned about it and appealed the decision, we would then get the opportunity to exercise, our review, our judgment of the policies affected. But I just, I don't think that we've brought that same, I feel like the DLC is the one that's bringing the value, really, to the creative value to these projects. And that if we found a way to keep them engaged in it or be better engaged in even I think a type 2 would really satisfy what we're expressing our concerns to be.
maybe a clarifying question on a practical impact is, what's the cost of a type 2 permit versus a type 3 permit for staff? Because I could see a situation where an applicant gets their type 2 permit and appeal is filed. They end up in a staff intensive process, and maybe the city hasn't recouped the costs for that staff intensive process. Again, that's probably outside of our purview to figure out, and probably more something city council and the city manager would care about. But it seems like you could find yourself in a laborious space and not necessarily recouping the expenses for that.
Yeah, and of the 4 or 5 cases that we've had come through over the last few years, I mean, each one has obviously been a little bit different. It feels like a majority of them have had some other aspects, other applications like a variance or a natural resource review or something like that would maybe bring them to the planning commission anyway. So it's worth considering that. I think the idea was that in the situation where all you have to worry about for your site is just the downtown design review piece, there's no natural resource piece, you're not asking for any variances or anything like that, then I think that the thinking was, well, at least what I think Commissioner Edge is thinking is that in those cases where it would otherwise be simple, it could just stay at the type 2 level. But obviously Coho Point had to come to you because there were all kinds of other things attached with that. And the same with Henley Place, it had the natural resource area that needed review. So it's probably a little bit of a mixed bag. Axle Tree, I mean, again.
So is there any example where it would have gone through type 2 and wouldn't have, not that I recall in recent history.
Yeah, maybe not, especially for that reason, for the step, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about the step back for the design review piece alone. I don't know. I'd have to look again at the.
I agree, Vice Chair Edge, that the DLC does provide, the greatest value in terms of their feedback. As a committee, they tend to be more a body that is composed of developers, architects, et cetera, with that kind of design eye and thinking. I think from my experience coming to the Planning Commission, y'all are great, but not the same kind of intensity of thinking around those kind of architectural elements. And so I do agree that the value is with the DLC, but it's just the fact that they're a committee and not a commission, and they don't have really the authority, and they're really recommending, and recommendations can go one way and then they can also just go another way. And it always felt like they needed to come to the big brother of the planning commission in order to have their kind of judgment or recommendations have any weight.
Well, if it were a type 2, the weight would be with me, with the planning manager, to decide whether or not, like, I would look at their recommendation, right?
Yeah.
That would be the check.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's whether or not, I mean, I'm not an architect, to be clear. Some other planning manager might be an architect, right? So
Right.
that's the difference, but that would be the ultimate, that it would come to me, and I would make the call.
Okay.
I think nothing against you, Laura, as an individual, but I feel like our community has a higher expectation on some of these projects that, while in the scheme of things, might be small. In Milwaukee, each development is fairly transformative.
I mean, I totally agree, and I tend to think that, and this is one of the things that I kind of struggle with from a planning commission, is that as we talk about code amendments that have 20-year and 50-year like scale of impact, my God, it's like, oh, well, a building is immediately impactful to how someone experiences and feels either views or lack of views or pedestrian element that's kind of in the scale of your lifetime of how you perceive a city. And so those things in my mind are like way more impactful to at least the immediate. And it's hard for me to scale out to a 20-year or 50-year kind of thing. So that's why.
Kind of along those same lines, I just want to point out that if it is a type 2 with a recommendation from DLC to the planning manager, appealable to the planning commission decision is the final land use decision of the city. So that could potentially be appealed to LUBA. So is the planning commission or how a city council going to look upon a recommendation from you on this code that's going to have one of those large transformative big developments go to LUBA on planning commission's watch without having the ability to have that final say? Mm-hmm. I just point that out as a point of reference where the land use decision stops and the type 2 appeal at the planning commission. So that decision wouldn't go to the city council. So that might factor into calculus. And I frankly, as I sit here, I don't know how city council would think about that, but I have a feeling they'd want to chat about it.
Right, exactly. Agreed. Well, so Brett, I kind of feel a little bit like we've gone astray here, like this wasn't part of the discussion necessarily.
Let's keep it a 6-foot setback.
Well, we got that note. I think the Commissioner Edge's suggestion came up in the context of asking whether there was some comfort with establishing that kind of bifurcation of type 3 for new buildings for discretionary review if they can't meet all the standards, or are you comfortable dropping to type 1? Because right now in 19.907, if you're a new building downtown, you start at type 2 review. So even if you show you're meeting all the standards, you still have to go through this partially discretionary process and sending public comment out to people who the applicant would say, I'm meeting the standards. What can you make me do that, that's different? So I think that was the thinking, especially in the context of if we do require multifamily buildings downtown to only address the downtown design standards and not look at the more general multifamily ones. And since if we did that, we would have to allow a type 1 and then probably type 3 option. Why not do that for other buildings, mixed use, other buildings downtown?
And this is just maybe going back to the staff memo. This is our first bullet point on that list, I believe. The review types for residential only and other new buildings. Is that what you're talking about right now?
Yes.
Yeah, I feel totally comfortable with that recommendation, just to move us along. I don't know if others do.
Okay.
At least it was going up when I type it. It's one of those. It doesn't, it fakes you out.
We're having some in-person AC issues for our virtual commissioners. It's extremely
It's
cold
freezing in here.
They're trying to make sure we do not fall asleep during
It's not
this
adjustable.
meeting.
I already tried.
Or they just
Sorry.
want this meeting to end quickly. So with that in mind, so Brett, I think we've given you quite a bit to like, at least from the, I don't know if you come back to us with some suggestions about the review process, or if we just end it with this, what seems like we're saying is maintaining the code as it is. Or if you all need to continue to think about the type 2 versus the type 3.
I think we can continue to think about it, but it sounds like to me there's a majority of an understanding that we want to keep the code as it is. I mean,
On step backs.
yes.
Well,
I mean,
on,
can we just take these items one at a time and talk about them?
You know how hard it is?
Yes.
We're kind of in a little bit of pinball.
I think so.
well, on the step back issue, it sounded like the direction I was taking was that your comfort level was more with just leaving it the way that it is.
Yes,
So I
correct.
kind of moved on from that.
Yeah.
With respect to this process, review process, there are kind of two elements to the question. One is, do you agree that it makes sense to require that a multifamily or multi-unit residential building downtown only go through the downtown design review process, instead of allowing them to address the more general standards of 19.505? Our recommendation was to pull them into the same downtown design review process.
I think that was agreed upon already. Yes.
And then the other element of that question then is, and so for other buildings downtown, non-multifamily ones, which currently start at, I meet the standards, but I have to go through type 2 review, are you comfortable dropping them down to the same type 1 level and saying, if you meet these standards, type 1 review? I don't know why we're having a type 2 process for it. That's the second question with that.
I feel comfortable with that.
I'm in agreement with that too. If it's fine for multi-family, then I don't know why it wouldn't be fine for mixed use. Because then as long as we keep that 6-foot step back in there, because we know they'll always do a type 3.
And then in that process, you would get feedback from the DLC?
Not if it's a type 1. It's either type 1 or type 3, no type 2.
Didn't you just say type 2?
No.
I say they start right now
Start
at
at a
type 2.
type 2.
But there's no DLC meeting required currently for
With
type
type
2.
two.
Okay, so they would drop to a type 1?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Would you like me to put the slides back up to just walk through some of the other issues? Okay.
Yeah.
But I think we have
Got
an
it.
agreement on that, so we would go to type 1, we would move the type 2.
But you still are going to give out a public notice irregardless, right?
So I'd like to talk about that, because I'm not sure I see diminishing return on sending out a public notice to a type 1.
We talked about it being a courtesy. It's just a courtesy, saying this is happening. We wanted you to be aware, because buildings that happen, I mean, it's to Commissioner Hemer's point, I think that there's like this notification, but that there isn't any opportunity to comment. It's just allowing people to know that something is happening.
Pure inform.
Pure informational.
Yeah.
I guess I don't support it. Sending out mailers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
You're the paper
I guess-
police. Are you advocating that we
No,
kill more
it's
trees?
it's public notice, so it's within 300 feet, right? It still holds to the standard, so it's 300 feet. I'm assuming you can just give it to a building and not every individual in the building.
I guess I would
Oh, you have
propose
to give it to the building.
perhaps rather than, notifying property owners adjacent within 300 feet, I'd propose something maybe alternative. I went to the planning website before this, and, our list of applications is only relevant to type 3 and type 4. There's nothing about type 1 or type 2s. What if everything just ended up on the website, and maybe also as part of a standard operating procedure rather than our code, the link to that website went out every week in Jason's email to all the NDAs. So everybody just got it as the update of, here's the link about all the development projects that are happening in the city. Go check it out.
I'd be much more in support of something like that than additional paper for the sake of.
No. So
I actually think, get it into either the email or the pilot or something so that you're bringing people to those resources rather than spending extra dollars and killing extra trees.
Well, and listing the type 1s and type 2 on the planning website would require a lot more staff time because there's a lot of them.
yeah,
We
that's
can't list
the
them,
big-
that's expensive. So we have 50 or 60 of those a year compared to having,
What's the, sorry, I'm,
it's
what
just
is
time, staff time having to build in all of those links. I was just.
the literal link? The literal link to the
Links, but
packet?
you'd have to add all of the package. You'd have to put all of the information from type 1 and type 2 on the website, which we don't currently do, and that's a lot more
Okay,
application.
what if it were basically similar to the courtesy mailer? A courtesy, I don't know, if it's not the entire,
But maybe the distinction if it's for development just in downtown.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. I mean, that's the
Yes.
scope we're
That-
talking
that-
about, right? Is we're not talking about across the whole city.
Right,
We're-
okay. 'cause
right,
like,
right, which
no,
is
we're not
more
doing
like 2 or 1.
that. Right. We could possibly do that. Yes, that seems much more manageable. Sorry,
What still seems easier to me is just sending a note to the historic NDA chair and then letting them disseminate the information.
But I think Commissioner Hemer, as like a former neighborhood association president outside of this city, like I've received all of those in my time. And, when you don't go check the mailbox for 2 weeks, like it's just,
I sent an email, not your regular mail. And look, the reason why I think it's important about the public notice is because, yes, there are things that are standards in the code that cannot be changed. But the color of the windows, the color of the brick, the color of the walls, those are not defined in our code. And so that if a conversation happens, because I can guarantee you that if a builder says, well, look, here's my materials, and I got to paint the building anyways, they probably really don't care what color it is, unless if they're going to paint it all white and beige, because those are the 2 cheapest colors.
Commissioner Hemer, I appreciate the sentiment. I think I worry about, having it as a physical mailer that only goes to the historic Milwaukee NDA.
Well, I'm
nothing
back to my
against
300
them. I
feet.
just
I'm
worry,
back to my 300
or 300 feet. I think
And a sign.
I think there's many members of our community who care about downtown, and just put it up on the website as a link that anybody could go and see. So it's not some privy knowledge to only the select few who get the notification. I think it's a more equitable outreach process if you just took that, digitized it, put it up on the web so any Milwaukeean can see it, and then go have that have that conversation with the developer about, don't paint it beige, paint it green, because that's my favorite color. Like that.
Well, with a type 1, you're not going to nobody's having a conversation with a developer about
Well,
what colors
the
are
Greg
getting painted.
Kemers of the world, they might actually call up the developer and say, hey, can I get the sign out of the bowling alley and preserve it forever? And you know what? That's how the magic sometimes happens.
Chair.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a proponent of the 300-foot piece of paper. And the reason I'm a proponent of it is that I just think it's a forcing function. Will they all see it? No, but there'll be a portion of people who will have a piece of paper, will read it, will either throw it in the trash, or they'll act on it and do something else and make a phone call or whatever. They'll do something with it. If it goes to an email, well, I get a lot of email. And you know what? I don't open it all. But if someone hands me a piece of paper, if they stick it in front of my face, I read it. Okay? I'm not like everyone, I admit that, but I just think a piece of paper is a forcing function. And I think that people will do something with it. They'll decide to ignore it. They'll decide to do something with it. But I think that relying solely on email it's going to be a high percentage of ignored emails.
Or relying on people to know to go to a website to check out something for something that they don't even know that is coming.
I'll just
Chair.
Frank, I cannot support a physical mailer to a select group of individuals. I think it's inherently inequitable, and I think there's many members of our community that care about downtown, and why people living within 300 feet of downtown would be the only people to know about something when people in Linwood might also care about it. I won't support that.
You can do both.
Commissioner, Vice Chair Hitch. I'm going to rein this in a little bit because I think we've talked about it too much.
I can post it online too. I can start a whole community discussion with thousands of members if we'd like. Like, I'm with you on that.
Okay. Any other?
Thank you, Chair. What I wanted to say is that obviously there's interest in being inclusive with the community and making sure that the community is notified about what's going on. Obviously the commission, many members, most of the members, if not all the members of the commission feel that way about it. And so that's great. What I think that we should do is not try to be prescriptive about this. So work session, let's express our interest in including the community in some way, and we're basically refer it to city council, and see what they're interested in pursuing in terms of how we would engage the community about downtown projects, and not try to solve this tonight ourselves.
I tend to agree.
Compromise.
Although I also inherently refuse to send out mailers just for the sake of sending out mailers.
You get thousands of pages that are printed online all the time. What are you worried about saving the tree?
It's the grocery store kind of idea. Like, locate the milk and eggs in the back of the store so that people can find things along their way. So put it on the pilot or put it on the website, so along the way they find out about the Arts Commission, or they find out about whatever. Anyways, Brett, what else? I feel like we hadn't even really necessarily discussed the important things that you presented.
Well, I think we actually have hit on quite a few of them, the ones that we were looking for some feedback and having some discussion on. I think, some of the ones that I thought were a little simpler are the ones that I reviewed early in the presentation. One was just like eliminating actions for which we have no standards.
Totally agree.
That's good.
That's obvious.
This is my favorite slide title I've seen in quite a while. I appreciate the creativity.
That's our planning manager at work right there. She boiled it down.
What is that we're trying to say?
She boiled it down. And then I thought this was the one about townhouse density. Seemed like kind of
that's obvious.
a no-brainer. The feet, not stories, we were hoping would be simple, with the explanation that, we could certainly bring those two things together in our informal, staff report and presentation materials to make sure that people understand how many stories the actual building is going to be.
And I would even suggest, I recognize this is a downtown focus, but I think we should think about that across the board, because things like NMU also is in height and stories. And I recognize that's a larger project, but I think we should carry that forward into those other spaces.
Yeah.
Great idea. We should do that this time around. We should make that happen.
We talked about this a little bit, type 1 and type 3, the multifamily as well. So I think we got through that one. I feel like, yeah, a little bit. And then the step back, I think we got some clear direction from you about that as well. And the public notice we were just talking about. So those were the issues that we had identified in the staff report, I think.
Okay, I'm just curious because signage is another thing that I recall came up frequently, was, let's see, triggered through the DLC, but no direct language. Building signage in particular was a gray area. And am I correct in saying that? I'm trying to recall why. I don't need to make additional work for anybody, but
how about we go back and look at it, and if there's some issue, we'll bring it back to you at the hearing. But I
I guess I'm just
recall there
surprised
being
that that's kind of it. That's what we're talking about.
Well, there was some discussion, certainly with the DLC, about whether or not to try to establish some kind of rules or standards for signage downtown. Right now, the sign code has pretty clear standards for signage. There's a recognition that signage with a new building, they can obviously be better or worse integrated.
I think that the signage requirements are fairly broad, though, and that like from a downtown perspective, there might be other layers. That's what I remember. And that came up on Axle Tree, for example.
Yeah, I think, again, a note for the discussion is that it seems like often what happens is the developer is pretty focused on a lot of the other architectural elements of the building and isn't necessarily coming forward with their signage. They actually don't know who their tenants are going to be. Maybe there's an overall building sign, Axle Tree Apartments, or if they even have a name. But I think some of the discussion that we had kind of came back to that point of like, it feels a little early in the process. By the time someone's presenting their development plan for design review, they don't know who their tenants are, and they maybe haven't picked a name for the building. They're not ready to talk about signage, and so it seemed like it was a little premature. But there was discussion about it, and I guess if you can come up with some standards that drill down more beyond what's already in the sign code, then we could look at it. But the DLC did address, and it is included as a design element, lighting. I mean, building lighting, feeling it was reasonable to be addressing that at the time that you're coming up with the overall design of the building. Signage felt like maybe a step too far beyond that.
And then the other question I have is just the integration of art.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay?
I'd like to talk about that as well,
Oh,
briefly.
brief.
Go ahead, why don't you lead us on that, Lauren? Let's see what your feelings are.
Well, I believe art should be integrated. But it was so in certain, and Axle Tree is just one that's like very present to all of us. We might as well use that one. So in Axle Tree, for example, we had a number of areas on the facade that were blank, and that there was concern that we weren't meeting we were meeting the kind of transparency and opaque kind of requirements, but there were just a lot of area along that pedestrian main street where there was nothing. And so through the DLC, because of that conversation a number of times with the developer, they did integrate not only the mural, the multi-story mural to the south, but also the metal, CNC'd metal panels that you see on Washington Street. So I think, but that only came because it was a result of our conversation and a result of the work through the DLC, and I think it would be best if it weren't a negotiation, which is unclear and is subjective, that rather there is some kind of process for art integration.
Yeah, I can address that. Let me separate two things. What I took the spirit of Commissioner Hemer's original suggestion to be was like, I don't care if you got blank walls or not, I want some public art as part of that building, was how I interpreted it. Maybe that isn't correct.
So public art.
What you're addressing is correct with Axle Tree, for example. They had a blank wall. They weren't meeting some standards related to providing some facade transparency. And so let me share a screen here. So that is addressed in this draft. I've got a copy. This was one of the attachments from the August 9th packet. It was, we included like the current drafts of the code. This is under the, let me just scroll up here to this little subsection for reference. So this is under facade transparency, so it's element D, and this is in 19.508. And there are some design standards about minimum glazing for a Main Street or other block faces, upper floors. We have an updated graphic, and then we have the standard here, a street facing, whoa, that is bigger than I wanted. Street facing blank walls containing no glazing limited to X square feet. If you exceed that amount of blank wall, you have two options. And so what the DLC came up with was either kind of a landscaping option or a public art mural. So that's continuing to address the thing that Lauren, or Chair Loosefeld, that you're talking about with Axle Tree. They didn't meet a standard. They exercised, I mean, I can't remember actually at the time, this is 2017, so I'm not sure if this was the same code, but this is getting at that idea of like, if you can't meet the standard, you have some options. One of them could be, in this case, a public art mural. So I guess the question is, does this seem satisfactory for addressing the potential for street-facing blank walls?
I think so. However, that backside mural was not street facing. That was like a bonus, if you recall. It's, it's not off of any of the public
Right.
streets. So how do you address that?
On that one, I could,
Because that's going to be a blank wall for a number
For a while,
of years,
right.
right? And so
Right.
that's, that mural actually has more impact to the downtown than the metal panels that were CNC'd. And it's, I would say it's kind of iconic now. It's kind of a landmark of at least for the Max line and that area entering into the city. So it's a pretty impactful thing. So can we address just blank walls and kind of what would otherwise be blank walls on non-pedestrian street facing?
well, I suppose we could.
You can say visible from the street. For a clear and objective standard, you could say visible from the street. Or a public right of way.
I guess that, one way to look at it might be seeing if we want a very specific to this section of code kind of definition of what does street facing mean? Does it mean it can be at present time visible from a public street? I think what I'd like to do too is just double check the details of the Axle Tree project to figure out, to kind of remind myself of what it was that was happening. Like how did they come to the mural? If there wasn't a street facing facade requirement, what drew that out, just so we have better understanding of that.
Well, Axle Tree had like the advantage or the disadvantage, depending on how you look at it, of being kind of one of the first landmark developments in downtown.
Mm-hmm.
And so we maybe as a DLC had a little bit more leverage, or there just seemed to be a little bit more of kind of negotiation with the group and like applying the standards. And my memory, it's nothing that we did necessarily except expressing the fact that there's this blank face. There's nothing that our guidelines required them to actually address that. But I think they were rather, they were inspired by the history of that site, and then the mural's design came, I think, maybe partially as a process of those discussions.
Yeah, I think it may have been that since it got into the discretionary design review process, and especially with the current structure of having to address a separate document and these design elements that don't necessarily match up real well, plus the current purpose statement, I guess, of whatever section of the current code relates to that, maybe that might have given a little bit of leverage to say, well, since you're asking me in a discretionary process, I think for you to be able to meet the purpose of this element, I need you to do something like that, because I'm not convinced that you're achieving the facade transparency purpose or something like that. We can check into that. And again, like maybe we can check to see if there's a way to kind of micro define street facing here so that to be fair to a developer, if we all know that a new building is coming pretty soon after this one, to require someone to spend a lot of time and money, like putting something up that's going to shortly thereafter be covered, also seems a little ridiculous, or unfortunate, maybe not ridiculous, but otherwise, I mean, considering the situation, like you said, we're probably going to see that mural in Axle Tree for a little while. Yeah.
Right. And if the amount of locations within the downtown that might get developed that would have a blank face are more the majority than these one-off kind of areas where it would be less of a concern. We're going to have more of those kind of party wall conditions than we are going to have, lots that have all pedestrian-facing streets.
Mm-hmm.
That's my guess. More infill, in other words.
Chair, could I offer some comments?
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. So one thing I've been thinking of is the clear and objective standards and trying to satisfy a public art requirement. And what I would be interested in us doing, rather than, again, being prescriptive about this, would be kind of putting the question before City Council. Is there, perhaps interest in having a clear and objective standard where you set aside a certain space for public art and then, go into a separate process, perhaps with Art Mob or the RACC or whatever, a separate process, a separate application, separate review that would actually get the arts, in a public process to get, the artist selected and the actual art, chosen and everything. But, the idea would be the clear and objective standards say set aside space for art and get into a process to actually put some art there. But we wouldn't hold up your certificate of occupancy based on, that art not yet having been delivered. Because we need the clear and objective standards. And so it feels kind of like a compromise to me of being able to say, yes, art is important. We want to have the space for art in new developments, but we know we can't really design clear and objective language around art. So, is there any kind of interest in maybe pushing a recommendation like that on the City Council to say, is this something that we should be, perhaps exploring further? Maybe we need to, maybe it's not part of this process. Maybe it comes later and they look at it a little bit more closely. There's a lot of cities, and I apologize, I don't know if we have this, but there's a lot of cities have 1% for art. There's a 1%, tax or fee on development projects. And that 1% gets either put into a FILO for public art, or it actually goes towards, putting public art installation on the site. And that way, again, clear and objective, it's scaled to the size and the costs of the development. Again, would be detached from the actual discretionary public process that would come later, or it would be prescribed by it, but it would be a separate process that would allow us to not really have that be impacted by the clear and objective standards requirement.
Right, but you would still require public art.
The space, you have to set aside the space, and you have to enter into you either have to pay the FILO or enter into a permit or a permitting process, review process to do, have the public art done. But it wouldn't be part of your.
I understand I understand the suggestion, but I don't think I would support it because the integration is within the project itself assures that the art is actually more distributed across kind of the downtown than located in a specific area, if I'm understanding you correct.
I guess, but if something like a fee in lieu of, could help create funding to, for the city to go put art in the right of way, kind of anywhere in the downtown. I think generally, I appreciate some of your thoughts on this, Vice Chair Edge. Just thinking about downtown areas that are vibrant, that people enjoy spending time in. Art, I think, is one of the things, to use a word you used earlier, Chair Losfeld, it's pretty iconic in most of those settings. And so I think thinking about opportunities to integrate public art, what's the mechanism, I think is maybe the question. Or to me, that's the question. I don't think it's the spirit. I think we should find a way to make a recommendation to council on this. And maybe staff can spend more time thinking about the mechanism.
So I'm going to go on the record, and I would say that we're going to, with this revision of code, that we require public art. However, whatever art is, and I'm not Larry Flint, so I can't tell you what it is, because you know where it is when it is. And so I don't think that it shouldn't be up to the planning director to say, okay, well, that's art. I think what the concern is from the city. But I think that if we require public art, wherever that is in the building, which then can be viewed by the public, however that looks, it could be a mural. You could say that, I am making an egg-shaped building, and that is actually giving the art, right? It's a unique architecture. And so we do have this wonderful arts committee that they already do a process for murals as it is anyways, that they could be set aside. So I like actually Commissioner or Vice Chair's Ed's idea that, right, you don't hold everything all up unless if they are in the process for the public art. And that public art could be wherever they want it on their space. They're just required to come. It could be a fountain. It could be a sculpture. It could be a painting on the wall. It could be anything. Don't be prescriptive about what the art is, but create public art. And the reason why I'm going to stand so firm on this one is because I have been involved in this city for 25 freaking years. Every time a code thing comes up where we could put in public art, what's the answer? Oh, well, we'll do it again. And I'm not going to stand for it this time. And neither should this commission. You hear the residents ask for the art. Let's do it this time. Let's actually do it this time. Have some gumption. I'm going to stick with that. And I hope the commissioners will too as well. It's not that big a deal.
What, okay. I guess my position would be that I would rather see it not fee in lieu of, but rather see it integrated into the building itself as a solution for things like blank facades, pedestrian and interaction, and elements that are otherwise undesirable from a pedestrian's perspective to that particular site, that particular building, rather than seeing it go through a commission, potentially going to a different location, not associated with the building at all, whatever it might be, and happening years down the road potentially. But I do think that the integration of art is really critical, and so it needs to happen. I would just suggest that it happen within the building design itself and not as a separate element.
Chair, I agree with that, because even if the spinoff from the fee in lieu of turns out great, then you're still stuck with a building with 4 big walls on it that may have no interest, and you're stuck with that for as long as the building is there. So I agree with you.
I don't think that's true. I think you have to meet standards, including blank wall standards, but
Oh, I think we're saying there's no blank wall standard, right?
There is for street-facing walls.
Street facing,
Right.
but there's other walls.
But are you?
when
would you
we talked
require the
about
public
possibly
art?
revising.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, we were trying to find a way in which we could incorporate those other highly visible area walls, facades of the building, which are not necessarily street facing, just like Axletree. So how do you address those big blank facades?
Well, let's see, that's where I think, like, trying to identify the two separate issues. One, it sounds like you're talking about a potential blank wall that may not be addressed right now in the current proposed standards. And this other part we're talking about is like a public art element for the overall building.
I
Could be
agree,
a
they're
statue on top,
they are
out
separate
front.
topics,
So-
I agree.
And I think I would be somewhat
Very
okay
separate.
with some level of blank face wall where, I could imagine, a blank face wall with one of the beautiful sculptures in our sculpture garden down in front of it, architecturally lit at night. So has the blank face wall as the backdrop for something like that. I could see something like that working well. So anyway, that's just, I guess, a piece of what I'm
Okay.
thinking.
There's a cool building on the southeast side by Burnside Bridge where they stuck a bunch of trees onto the side of the building. That's art, man. It's really cool looking. Let them decide what their art should be. You could integrate it in with that blank wall, or a statue, or a fountain, or hire a mine.
Right, I mean, I just, personally, knowing that requirement there actually gives us the leverage as designers to do some really interesting stuff. And you look at the dumbbell building that we lovingly refer to it next to the Burnside Bridge that's painted full scope on all building facades, right? That's how you get ideas like that. So I think have we shared enough?
Well, I think we do need to kind of walk out of here with like the distinction between the two things that we're talking about. One is to incorporate art into kind of the design of the building as you've talked about, Chair Losfeld. And then there's this separate issue, which is what Commissioner Heber
But it could
talking
be-
about. And what and Commissioner Sermon also talked about is like a sculpture in front of a building is different than requiring the art to be integrated into the building itself. And so,
But see, the art, right? I think what is happening is that you're decompartmentalizing these things when it doesn't need to be compartmentalized. If you have this thing that says, okay, well, you're blank, you can't have this so much blank wall, right? And one requirement is you already have a requirement that says you have to have a mural. Well, then that's your piece of art, right? If they use a mural there, then that's their piece of art. But if they don't have this situation, then they're still required to have a piece of public art.
I see they're two very different things.
Why? How?
Because one is something that we can kind of go through the code to and we can write into actual with the code. But then the other one is developing like what is that whole art program and what is the appropriate art and how are we defining that art? And a sculpture is different than something that's integrated into the building, is different than an egg-shaped building that is different than trees that hang off of the building. I think that there's just two different subjects that are going on here. One is a larger program than the thing that we're talking about right now. One is a program and one is an architectural feature, I believe. Is that a good distinction, or is that a distinction that makes sense?
I think it is, and I think the integration, at least what I heard you say, is that the integration of the art into the building at the discretion of the team does get at the core of value of what you're saying.
And if they don't want to do that and they just put a statue up, then they put a statue up.
And I guess maybe the distinction is maybe it's not the building, maybe it's the property, right? It's integrating art into the property, you know. It could be that sculpture.
So, okay,
That mural went through a process as it is anyways. It had to go through the art mob because the art mob has to review every mural. So then we can just ask them, hey, in the downtown zone, just review everybody's piece of public art when it goes through.
Again, that's a whole separate process outside of our process.
I know,
Land use
but we can
review,
still
that's two
require
separate
public
processes.
art.
I don't disagree. I'm just saying it's two separate processes. There's one that's insular to our group, to the code, and then there's a process outside of that. And Justin just pointed out to me that if we're going to go past 10 o'clock, we have to extend it.
We're not going past 10 o'clock. Because I stopped functioning 20 minutes ago.
Do we have agreement with the commissioners that we like the public art idea, no matter if it's integrated with the building around the property?
Are you the chair? I think we should do a straw poll. So, folks, okay, I just want to do a check-in here. How are we feeling on whether or not we agree that integration of art into the building itself is a concern of this commission that we would advocate for, and ask staff to go back to understand the best way to get there? I'm seeing
For that as well.
hands at the dais. I've also, Commissioner Freeman, I'm seeing hands raised, and all those who would oppose that direction of integrating art into the building. Okay.
I like the idea of having a fee in lieu of option, or doing something with the development, not necessarily the building.
Okay, so the fee in lieu of, where there is a separate process for allocating art, provided that there is some kind of funding where developers are allowed to avoid the requirement at the building itself, but provide funding for art somewhere else by some other group okay. Folks who are in support of that option. Okay?
Maybe.
Possibly.
It's not the ideal path.
And if we were going to, that would take some exploration.
Never
That is
is.
not an easy thing that this group could do. That is something that requires a whole nother level of work that's kind of, and I hate to say it, beyond the scope of this project, but I would want to have you all, if you wanted to do that, the recommendation would have to go to council, and then council would have to decide if that was something that they wanted us to pursue, and then we would have to fit it into the other work that we're doing, because it's outside of the land use process.
So I'm going to retract my hand now with that additional explanation. My hand was never fully up for the record. Let the
Just pat
record
yourself on
show.
the back.
Yeah. But now it is down.
So Laura and Brett, does that give you clarity on that particular issue? And do we, because I still think, is there a third question, which is how concerned are commissioners about non-street facing requirements for art?
I have that question on my list to kind of confirm how things are set up to work and if there's a way to try to address, however temporary it might be, a non-street facing wall. In terms of the other art aspect, based on, Laura's direction about, it being a whole separate process to develop some kind of program for art.
We're sticking with just, can we address the issue that you raised, Chair Losfeld, about the art not being street facing, but if we have an axle-tree situation, can we write code to ensure that we're getting that built into the building?
Yeah, and I just want to ask the commission, because I mean, it's my personal opinion that we should consider those, because
And I think Brett is saying that, yes, we can go back and take a look at that. That is something that is within our realm of possibility.
I
But
get
you
that
wanna
you
see
can
if
do it, but I
you're in
actually
the
want to
minority.
ask in a democratic
sorry.
way.
I'm telling you.
If I'm the only one out on a limb here, or if others have equal concern, so another straw poll. Do you feel like major facades of buildings that are not street facing should be a concern of the commission relative to material or art?
And before we do that, I move to extend the meeting by 5 minutes.
I'll second that.
Second.
Moved and seconded, all in favor? Aye, please.
Nay.
All opposed?
Right.
Oh!
4 seconds. Our meeting is.
Raise your hand, please, if you agree that non-street facing should be looked at. Okay, it's.
If it
What
ain't-
just happened?
If it
Justin? Our
integrates
meeting
public-
is over. It's.
It's like the ball is being thrown by the quarterback. It's a Hail Mary, and we are voting. I see quorum, I see approval, and so with that, I'll take a motion.
Street visible.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, it is. Oh, that was really exciting. That's really exciting.
So,
Thank you, Amy and Josh, by the way.
Visible.
Okay.
Amy is trying to say something.
muted.
Commissioner Ert is trying to say.
So we got 9
No,
minutes.
we
No, she's
can't
not.
hear her because everyone's talking.
Street visible. Street visible. I liked that term, street visible. So, yes.
Agree. Okay.
So with the extension, we have 9 more minutes to go.
No. Well, I'm going to give it all to Laura for forecast of future meetings. Okay,
Forecast of future-
Brett, do you have enough material here?
I think we got a lot. I think we got a lot tonight. Thank you very much. Yeah,
Okay.
a lot of good material.
I'm going to skip. Do commissioners have other?
October 5th, Letting Library Lecture Series, Confederated Tribes of Grand Run, history and demonstrations be there.
Does anybody else have anything to contribute? Okay. No. Laura, forecast of future meetings, please.
Again, we've already said it all. October 11th, CIAC meeting with John Hennington, joint neighborhood NDA meeting with the Planning Commission, October 11th. October 25th, we get to talk about these two things all over again, except for in a hearing environment. That's it.
Okay. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Oh,
We have a second. We got two first, though.
I need a second, please.
I second.
No, John, come on.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Good night.